Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity takes its time and science finds a gentler way to wander. Tonight's story begins long before us, before languages, before names, before anything that could look back at the sky and wonder what it meant to exist. We're going to trace the line of rulers that came before humans, the true masters of this planet who built it, shaped it, and ruled it for far longer than we've been here. But before we start, I'd love to know something. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Maybe you're curled up in bed, maybe you're on a quiet walk, or maybe you're somewhere far from city lights, listening to the slow hum of the earth itself. Wherever you are, thank you for being here. And if you find this little journey through time soothing or fascinating, I'd be so grateful if you gave the video a like, maybe even subscribed. It helps this calm corner of science find others who might also need a peaceful space to wonder. So let's settle in, take a slow breath, because before we can understand who ruled the earth before us, we have to return to a time when the earth had no rulers at all. If you could somehow travel back 4.5 billion years, you wouldn't find the familiar blue marble you see in photographs. You'd arrive in a world that barely resembled a planet at all. The early Earth was raw, unfinished, and endlessly violent. Its surface was molten rock, constantly bombarded by leftover fragments of the solar system. Volcanoes erupted without pause, spilling lava across vast plains, and the air was thick with steam, carbon dioxide, methane, and ammonia. The sky wasn't blue. It glowed a dull orange-grey, heavy with dust and lightning. Oceans didn't yet shimmer under sunlight. They boiled, and the continents we know today, those calm, solid pieces of land, were still forming, rising and sinking as the crust tried to cool. It was a planet trying to find its balance, and yet, even in this chaos, something was already beginning. In the cracks of rocks and the shadows of ancient volcanic vents, chemistry was stirring toward biology. Scientists think that somewhere in those early oceans, simple molecules collided again and again until one of them did something extraordinary. It copied itself. That moment, whenever and however it happened, was the quiet beginning of everything that would follow. Life, in its most basic form, appeared. Not plants or animals, not anything that could be seen, but microscopic chemistry that could grow, change, and endure. From that moment, Earth was no longer just a rock in space. It was a living world. For hundreds of millions of years, life remained almost invisible. No forests, no coral reefs, no birds in the sky. Only single-celled organisms drifting in water, multiplying, dying, and leaving traces so faint they're almost impossible to find in the rocks today. But those traces exist. They tell us that the earliest rulers of Earth weren't mighty beasts or towering trees. They were tiny, soft, and unimaginably simple. They were the bacteria, the original conquerors of the planet. We tend to think of bacteria as something small, something beneath notice, or even something dangerous. But if you could look at Earth's history as a timeline stretching from its birth to now, bacteria ruled nearly the entire length of it. For more than 3 billion years, they were the only form of life here. Every ecosystem, every niche, every resource was theirs. They were the architects of the biosphere, experimenting, adapting, and finding ways to live in places no other creature could ever survive. In boiling hot vents, they learned to feed on sulfur. In shallow seas, they found energy in sunlight. In frozen mud, they went dormant, waiting for warmth to return. They were the first to invent nearly every survival trick life would ever use. These early bacteria didn't think or move in any way we'd recognize, but they interacted. They swapped bits of genetic material, they shared successful strategies, and slowly, through countless generations, they began to alter their world. Every breath of oxygen you take right now, every flame that burns, every rusting piece of metal, exists because those early microbes changed the atmosphere. When a special group of bacteria called Cyanobacteria learned to use sunlight to make food, They began releasing oxygen as a byproduct. At first, it didn't stay in the air. It reacted with iron in the oceans, forming vast deposits of rust that still lie buried in ancient rock layers today. But eventually, as the iron was used up, the oxygen began to build up in the atmosphere. It was one of the most profound changes in planetary history, a global revolution that poisoned most existing microbes and cleared the way for new forms of life that could breathe oxygen instead of being killed by it. It's strange to think that the first great extinction on Earth was caused by the first great act of creation. The oxygen they released turned the sky blue, cooled the climate, and made possible the chemistry that would later give rise to plants, animals, and us. But at the time, the bacteria simply continued doing what they'd always done. Living, dividing, evolving. Theirs was not a reign of kings or empires, but of persistence. They ruled by endurance, not domination. They shaped Earth simply by existing in numbers beyond comprehension. And if you could look down at the planet then, it would not look empty anymore. The seas would be green with life. Shallow coastal waters would shimmer with mats of microbes forming layered structures called stromatolites. These strange, rocky domes still exist in a few remote places today, like ancient monuments left by the first builders of biology. They grew slowly, layer by layer, as microbes trapped sediment and secreted minerals. To us they might seem lifeless, but to early Earth they were bustling cities. It's humbling to imagine that the entire planet was once ruled by organisms smaller than the width of a hair. But their impact was so vast that even now, billions of years later, every breath you take, every bite of food you eat, still depends on their descendants. Without bacteria, the cycle of nutrients would stop, the soil would die, the oceans would turn barren. They are the invisible thread running through every living thing. Eventually, as oxygen filled the sky and the atmosphere stabilized, new possibilities opened. Cells began to grow more complex. Some started forming internal structures, primitive versions of what we now call organelles. Others learned cooperation. A single cell swallowed another, and instead of digesting it, kept it alive inside. That simple act, repeated countless times, led to one of evolution's greatest partnerships, the origin of the eukaryotic cell, the ancestor of all plants, animals and fungi. Within each of your own cells are tiny powerhouses called mitochondria, the descendants of those ancient captured bacteria. They still carry their own DNA, a quiet reminder of the time when they lived freely in the ancient seas. By now, the Earth was nearly 2 billion years old. The continents had begun to take shape. The climate had cooled enough for ice to appear at the poles, then warmed again, melting into vast oceans. Life continued to evolve in those oceans, always microscopic but increasingly varied. Some learned to form colonies, others to build shells, and some began to use one another as food. Predation was born, and with it the first stirrings of complexity that would eventually lead to the animal kingdom. But if you were there to witness it, you wouldn't see drama or conflict. You'd see slow-motion progress. Millions of years would pass in silence, with small changes accumulating until something entirely new appeared. Evolution doesn't hurry. It experiments endlessly, and only a few of its trials survive. Most of what has ever lived on Earth has vanished without leaving a trace. Yet from those vanished forms came the groundwork for everything that followed. Sometimes the planet itself would intervene. Earth's history has been punctuated by catastrophes. Around 2.4 billion years ago, after the rise of oxygen, the planet entered what scientists call the Great Oxidation event. The oxygen that transformed the atmosphere also cooled the planet so drastically that ice may have covered much of the surface. Some call this the first Snowball Earth. Imagine entire oceans locked under frozen crusts, continents buried in glaciers, sunlight bouncing off endless white. Many forms of life perished, but some endured, hidden near volcanic vents or trapped beneath thin layers of ice where liquid water remained. When the ice finally retreated, the survivors spread again, reshaping ecosystems and continuing the long march of complexity. These cycles of catastrophe and renewal would repeat throughout history. Each time life adapted, each time it reclaimed the planet in new and unexpected forms. It's easy to think of evolution as a steady climb toward intelligence or sophistication, but the truth is more subtle. Life doesn't aim for progress. It aims for survival. The rulers of each era are simply those best suited to the world as it is, and for nearly 3 billion years that world belonged to the microscopic. Even today, if you measure life by numbers, variety or influence, microbes still rule the planet. There are more bacterial cells in your body than human cells. In the oceans, they outnumber stars in the observable universe. In the soil, they build networks that sustain entire forests. They are the hidden majority, the ancient citizens who never gave up their crown. When we talk about who ruled the earth before us, we usually imagine dinosaurs or mammoths or maybe the great apes, but they all came late. The true sovereigns of the planet are those who were here first and will likely be here last. They live in boiling springs, in ice caps, in clouds, in your own lungs. They thrive in radioactive waste and at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Wherever life can exist, they exist. And when humans are gone, they'll still be here, quietly continuing what they started billions of years ago. As the microbial world stabilized and Earth's chemistry changed, the stage was set for something entirely new. The planet was ready for complexity. The oceans were rich in nutrients, the air filled with oxygen, and the surface no longer constantly scorched by meteor impacts. The time of single cells ruling alone was beginning to give way to something more visible, more organized, and in many ways more fragile. Somewhere, perhaps in shallow coastal lagoons or the dim light of the seafloor, groups of cells began to cooperate more closely. They formed tissues, built simple bodies, and created structures that could move, sense, and respond. The next rulers of Earth were about to arrive, not as conquerors, but as the next experiment in life's endless story. And so, the world that had once been molten fire and storm had become a living planet of oceans and light, quietly preparing for its next transformation. Life was ready to take new shapes, and the era of the unseen rulers was giving way to an age that would finally begin to leave fossils, movement, and colour. The seas were stirring again, and soon they would no longer be silent. If you could drift down through time to the world after Earth's first calm began, you'd see a planet wrapped in soft clouds and shallow oceans glowing faintly green. It wouldn't look empty anymore, though from above it might seem that way. Beneath those waves, the real rulers of Earth had taken their places. They had no eyes, no limbs, and no names, but they covered every surface, filled every droplet, and occupied every pore of stone. These were the microbes, the tiny monarchs, whose dominion stretched farther and lasted longer than any empire that would ever follow. Their world was slow. Everything happened in rhythms so long they would seem eternal to us. A single generation of these cells could pass in hours, yet the shape of their environment changed only over millions of years. They lived in a kind of steady balance, not needing much, giving and taking in cycles that built the foundation of all life to come. Theirs was not a rule of power or conquest, it was a rule of persistence. Some of these microbes fed on sunlight, capturing its energy through pigments that turned the ocean a hazy blue-green. Others hid from light entirely, living off the chemistry of the Earth itself, pulling energy from sulfur, iron or methane. Each had found a way to make a living from what the planet offered. Together they formed networks invisible to any eye but powerful enough to transform the entire world. In those shallow seas, something remarkable had already begun to happen. Layers of microbes grew one atop another, each trapping grains of sediment and leaving behind thin films of minerals. Over time, these films hardened into rock. The result was a landscape of strange mounds, stromatolites, like rocky bubbles scattered across the coastlines of the ancient Earth. Each one was a living city of bacteria, building itself upward toward the light. Inside those domes, countless generations of cells lived and died, leaving behind chemical fingerprints that we can still find today in rocks more than 3 billion years old. To understand how complete their rule was, imagine that every part of the planet's surface, oceans, lakes, volcanoes and ice, was a microbial kingdom. In each drop of water, billions of cells moved in microscopic currents. They traded molecules, broke apart minerals, built new ones, and shaped the chemistry of their world in ways no other creature could. The ocean's oxygen came from them. The balance of carbon in the air came from them. Even the first soils that formed on land were their work, created when colonies of microbes crept onto damp rock and began to break it down grain by grain. This was the age when Earth's chemistry and biology became one. Life was no longer a passive passenger on a cooling world. It had become an active force. Microbes altered the temperature of the planet by changing the gases in its atmosphere. They influenced the colour of the seas, the minerals that formed in sediment, and even the way sunlight was absorbed or reflected. For the first time, living things were shaping their own environment, setting in motion feedback loops that would define the next 4 billion years. And yet they did all of this without intention, without design, and without awareness. Each microbe simply followed the chemistry of survival. It took in energy, released waste, divided, and died. The miracle was not in any single cell, but in the vast collective web they formed together. You could call it cooperation, but it was more fundamental than that. It was connection, a network of exchange so intricate that modern scientists still struggle to model it. Even now, deep in the crust and at the bottom of the ocean, microbial colonies form similar networks. They move electrons through filaments like tiny electrical currents. They pass molecules between species that depend on one another's waste. Some communities have survived in isolation for millions of years, sealed beneath rock, recycling the same nutrients again and again. They are living fossils, direct heirs to that ancient rule. Among the early microbes, one particular innovation changed everything: photosynthesis. The bacteria that learned to use sunlight as fuel became the planet's first true engineers. By absorbing carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen, they began to rewrite the atmosphere. At first, the effect was subtle. Oxygen quickly reacted with iron dissolved in seawater, forming reddish particles that sank to the seafloor. Layer after layer of iron-rich sediment built up, creating what we now call banded iron formations, ancient geological records of their invisible labour. But as the ocean's iron was used up, oxygen began to accumulate in the air. Slowly, over millions of years, it transformed the planet. What had once been a poisonous gas to most life became the foundation for complex metabolism. The blue colour of the modern sky owes itself to that ancient microbial innovation. The same oxygen that allowed animals like us to exist once nearly wiped out all life on Earth. When oxygen levels rose, it triggered a crisis known as the Great Oxidation event. For the microbes that had evolved in an oxygen-free world, this new gas was toxic. It corroded their cellular machinery, destroyed delicate molecules, and left entire ecosystems gasping. Vast populations perished. But evolution is patient. Some bacteria developed defences, molecular shields that protected them from oxygen's damage. Others adapted more radically, learning to use the gas as fuel, extracting more energy from their food than ever before. Out of catastrophe came a new kind of life, one more energetic, more capable, and more versatile than anything before it. Those early survivors set the stage for the next leap in evolution. Some microbes began forming partnerships, merging into shared existence. A larger cell engulfed a smaller one, not to consume it, but to keep it alive inside. The smaller cell offered energy, the larger offered protection. Over time, this partnership became permanent. The smaller cell evolved into the mitochondrion, the powerhouse found in nearly all complex life today. That single merger, one microbe living inside another, was one of the most important moments in Earth's history. Every animal, plant and fungus is descended from that alliance. Even as these microscopic experiments unfolded, the world above remained alien. The continents were barren, baked by ultraviolet light, and battered by storms. Yet, even there, microbes began to spread. They formed slimy mats on wet rock, secreted acids that dissolved minerals, and laid the groundwork for soil. The smell of earth after rain, the scent called petrichor, still comes in part from chemicals made by soil bacteria. Their quiet work turned lifeless stone into habitable land. To say they ruled the earth is not poetic exaggeration. They were everywhere, in everything. The oceans were their domain, but so were the clouds, the lakes, and even the deep crust. Microbes were found miles below the surface, feeding on minerals and the faint warmth from the planet's interior. They lived in conditions that no animal could tolerate: boiling heat, crushing pressure, total darkness. Some fed on hydrogen from volcanic vents, others on methane seeping from the seafloor. Each discovered a new way to turn chemistry into life. The diversity of microbial life was staggering. Some could survive doses of radiation that would destroy a human instantly. Others could dry out completely and revive years later when water returned. They formed spores that could drift through space, potentially surviving for millennia. If life were ever to spread beyond Earth, microbes would be its first ambassadors. It's easy to overlook their achievements because we can't see them, but their influence is written everywhere. In every cell of your body, in the oxygen you breathe, in the carbon locked inside rocks, in the nitrogen that fertilizes crops, microbes made it possible. They were the first to fix nitrogen from the air into forms plants could use. They still perform that service today, feeding forests, grasslands and farms. Without them, the planet's ecosystems would collapse in weeks. There's a quiet irony in knowing that the most powerful beings to ever live were creatures too small to see. But power in nature rarely looks like what we expect. The microbial rulers didn't build monuments or leave fossils shaped like bones or shells. Their monuments are the atmosphere, the oceans, and the biochemistry of every living thing that came after. Their story also reveals something profound about life itself. It doesn't need intelligence or intent to change a world. The simple drive to survive, to grow, divide, and adapt is enough. Over time, those tiny acts accumulate into global transformations. The microbes didn't plan to create oxygen, soil, or complex organisms. They simply existed, and in doing so, reshaped their planet. Even now, they are far from dethroned. In the human gut, entire communities of bacteria digest food, produce vitamins, and train the immune system. In the ocean, vast blooms of microscopic algae feed whales and fish. In the clouds, bacteria act as nuclei for raindrops, helping control the weather. Deep underground, they form ecosystems that have never seen sunlight, running on the faint energy of Earth's heat. For every visible creature, there are trillions of invisible ones keeping the world balanced. Some scientists call this hidden network the microbiome of the planet, a web of life that connects all others. It's not just a poetic idea. Studies have found that soil microbes can influence plant growth thousands of miles away through airborne spores and chemical signals. Ocean bacteria affect the global carbon cycle, which in turn affects climate. The balance of gases in our atmosphere is largely the product of microbial metabolism. The Earth is, in many ways, a microbial machine. If you compress Earth's history into a single calendar year, with January 1st marking the planet's birth and December 31st representing today, microbes would appear before the end of January. Multicellular animals wouldn't arrive until late November. Dinosaurs would dominate in mid-December, and humans would emerge only in the last few minutes before midnight on New Year's Eve. For almost the entire year, the planet belonged solely to microbes. They were its creators, caretakers, and constant inhabitants. That kind of timescale can be hard to grasp. 1,000,000 years is beyond our ordinary sense of time, yet microbes measured their rule in billions. Civilizations rise and fall in thousands of years, species appear and vanish in millions. But the microbial line has continued unbroken from the very beginning. Every living thing on Earth, from an oak tree to an orca, is an offshoot of their family tree. If you look at your own reflection, you're not just seeing a human face. You're seeing a collection of ancient partnerships, cells descended from microbial ancestors, powered by microbial engines, maintained by microbial helpers. The bacteria that live inside you outnumber your own cells, and most are beneficial. They help digest food, regulate mood, and defend against disease. In a sense, you're not a single organism at all. You're an ecosystem, a mobile colony built on microbial legacy. So when we ask who ruled the Earth before us, the honest answer is that they still do. Our cities, technology, and culture may feel monumental, but they all depend on processes that microbes control. If they vanished overnight, oxygen would dwindle, ecosystems would collapse, and within weeks the planet would begin to die. They are the silent continuity beneath all change. Long before the first animal drew breath, before the first leaf unfolded, the Earth belonged to them. And as the ages moved forward, they continued quietly ruling beneath the surface, while other forms of life came and went. When the oceans froze, they hid beneath the ice. When volcanoes blackened the skies, they waited in the dark. When asteroids struck, they survived underground. They are the undefeated lineage, the thread that ties every era together. And yet, as stable as their rule seemed, the stage was slowly shifting. The chemistry of the atmosphere had changed. The oceans were filled with oxygen. The conditions that favoured microbial dominance were beginning to create opportunities for something else. New forms of life, larger, more complex, more visible, were about to appear. They wouldn't replace the microbes. Nothing ever could. But they would add new layers to the story, new ways of living and dying on a planet now ready for experiment. In the shallows, where sunlight filtered through water thick with green haze, colonies of cells began forming bodies. They weren't animals yet, not in the way we'd recognise. They were clusters, sheets, filaments, multicellular organisms in their earliest form. Each group of cells worked together, dividing tasks, protecting one another and sharing energy. It was the next step in life's quiet ascent. From those simple beginnings, the Earth's biosphere was about to grow more intricate, more colourful, and more dramatic. The microbial monarchs had laid the foundation. Their chemistry had built the sky. Their patience had formed the soil, and their endurance had given the planet its rhythm. Everything that came afterward, the forests, the creatures, the humans listening to this, would be their inheritance. And so, the seas that once shimmered with green microbial life were now becoming stages for new experiments in form and movement. The world was still theirs, but it was changing. The silence of the early oceans was giving way to motion, to shape, to the first faint signs of creatures that could swim, crawl, and sense the world around them. The microbial age would never truly end, but it was ready to share its throne. When the oceans began to clear and the haze of minerals settled from the air, a quiet transformation had already taken hold beneath the surface. It started with light, the most abundant source of energy in the young world, and with tiny cells that found a way to capture it. They were simple, almost featureless, yet within their membranes lay one of nature's most astonishing inventions. These cells could take sunlight and use it to power their lives. They could pull carbon dioxide from the water, split molecules, and build themselves from nothing more than light, gas, and minerals. Without meaning to, they became the first architects of oxygen. If you had been able to see those early oceans through human eyes, you wouldn't have noticed them at first. The water might have seemed faintly green, clouded with microscopic life. But beneath that surface calm, these organisms, Cyanobacteria, were carrying out the reaction that would one day make complex life possible. With every flicker of sunlight absorbed, they released tiny bubbles of oxygen. To us that seems harmless, even helpful. But to the world of the time, it was revolutionary and deeply dangerous. Before the rise of oxygen, Earth's atmosphere had been a suffocating mixture of gases: methane, carbon dioxide, water vapour, and traces of ammonia. The planet's chemistry was balanced for life that didn't need air. To those anaerobic microbes, oxygen was poison. It reacted violently with their molecules, corroding proteins, damaging DNA, and burning through cells that had no defences against it. When cyanobacteria began releasing oxygen in vast amounts, it was as if a new element of destruction had been unleashed on the planet. Entire ecosystems vanished. But evolution has always favoured change. Those who could adapt to oxygen survived, and those who couldn't faded into the deep, dark places of the Earth. Some found refuge underground or in sediments where oxygen could not reach. Others evolved new mechanisms to neutralise it, molecules that could handle the reactive gas safely. In doing so, they laid the groundwork for a kind of metabolism far more powerful than anything that had come before. Oxygen, once a threat, became a tool. Life learned not just to tolerate it, but to thrive on it. The cyanobacteria that started it all didn't know they were reshaping the atmosphere. They simply followed the same quiet rhythm that had guided all of life's history so far: grow, divide, persist. Their rule wasn't loud or violent, it was patient. Over millions of years, the oxygen they released began to accumulate, first in the seas and then in the air. Slowly, the sky began to change colour. What had once been thick and murky turned thinner, clearer, and eventually blue. The blue of the modern sky is, in a very real sense, the colour of bacterial breath. The transformation of the atmosphere wasn't just cosmetic, it altered everything about the planet. Oxygen allowed for the formation of the ozone layer, a thin shield high in the atmosphere that absorbs ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Without it, land would have remained barren and deadly. With it, the planet's surface could begin to host life. It also changed the climate. Methane, a potent greenhouse gas, was gradually broken down by oxygen, cooling the planet and triggering the first global glaciation. This event, known as the Great Oxidation, marked one of the biggest turning points in Earth's history. The air itself became a living thing, part of the planet's metabolism. It was no longer just a byproduct of volcanoes or chemical reactions. It was a reflection of biology. Every breath of oxygen that fills our lungs today carries that ancient signature. The Great Oxidation wasn't a single moment, but a long, drawn-out process. It unfolded over hundreds of millions of years, driven by the steady work of microscopic life. Imagine that, the entire composition of the atmosphere changing one molecule at a time, powered by sunlight falling on the ocean surface. The world turned slowly, and the bacteria continued their work, indifferent to time. As oxygen built up, it reacted with metals in the water, especially iron. The oceans, once rich with dissolved iron, turned red as the metal oxidized and precipitated out. These reactions created thick layers of rust-like minerals that settled onto the seafloor, forming what geologists now call banded iron formations. You can see them today in ancient rock outcrops, red and grey stripes frozen in time, each band representing cycles of microbial productivity and planetary transformation. They are the stone record of invisible labour left by organisms smaller than dust motes. Eventually, as the ocean's iron was depleted, oxygen could finally escape into the atmosphere. From that point forward, Earth's air would never be the same. The oxygen concentration rose slowly, fluctuating with the balance of photosynthesis and respiration. It was never a smooth climb. For long periods, the planet swung between breathable and suffocating conditions. But each rise in oxygen opened new possibilities for life. Organisms could now extract far more energy from food than before. They could grow larger, more active, and more complex. The architecture of the biosphere was being rebuilt from the bottom up. The architects themselves, those cyanobacteria, continued their quiet rule, spreading across oceans and forming massive colonies. Some floated freely, drifting with the currents. Others anchored themselves to shallow seafloors, building great layered structures that looked like fields of stone mushrooms. They covered coastlines, reefs, and tidal flats. In their stillness, they remade the planet. It's easy to forget how much time all of this took. From the first spark of photosynthesis to a truly oxygen-rich atmosphere, more than 1 billion years passed. That's nearly a quarter of the Earth's entire history. If you could watch it unfold from orbit, it would seem as if nothing was happening at all. But at the microscopic level, every photon absorbed, every molecule split, every bubble released was part of the process that built the world we live in, and it didn't stop there. Once oxygen became part of the environment, new chemistries emerged. Minerals that could never have formed in a reducing atmosphere now appeared: oxides, sulfates, carbonates. These new materials became part of the geological cycle, changing how rocks weathered and how nutrients cycled through the earth. Life and the planet became entwined in ways that could never be separated again. While all of this unfolded in the oceans, the continents above water were changing too. The constant erosion of rock-fed minerals into the seas, providing nutrients for microbial life. Volcanic gases mixed with the new oxygen, creating acids that fell as rain, dissolving stone and feeding more chemical reactions. The entire planet had become a vast system of feedbacks. Biology shaping geology, geology shaping biology. There's a kind of humility in realizing that the foundation of our breathable world was laid by creatures that had no idea what they were doing. They weren't striving toward complexity or planning for the future. They were just living. Yet, through that simple persistence, they accomplished what no intelligence could design: the transformation of a whole planet's chemistry into a system capable of sustaining forests, animals, and eventually consciousness. If we could stand beside one of those ancient microbial mats, it might not seem impressive. The surface would feel slick and soft under your fingers, smelling faintly of sulfur. But under a microscope, you'd see millions of cells moving and dividing, each one powered by light. Together they'd be releasing oxygen into the water, a quiet, steady exhalation that would eventually fill the skies. You'd be watching the beginning of air. Even after oxygen became abundant, the microbial architects never faded into obscurity. They adapted to new conditions, spread to every part of the world, and continued to drive the global cycles of energy and matter. They remain the basis of the oceanic food web even today. Every whale, every fish, every coral reef owes its existence to those early cyanobacteria and their descendants. The same process that filled the atmosphere with oxygen also changed the way carbon moved through the planet. Carbon dioxide, once dominant in the air, began to be drawn down into sediments as organic matter and carbonates. Over time, this reduced the greenhouse effect, cooling the planet further. Ice spread again, perhaps even covering the equator. Entire epochs of cold and warmth followed, each one driven by the balance between oxygen production and carbon storage. Life wasn't just surviving on Earth anymore, it was steering its climate. One of the most remarkable consequences of this oxygenation was the potential for new kinds of chemistry within cells. With oxygen available, organisms could break down food much more efficiently, producing many times more energy than before. This extra energy allowed for bigger cells, more complex structures, and eventually multicellularity. Without that energy surplus, the later evolution of plants, animals, and fungi would have been impossible. It's strange to think that every breath we take, every heartbeat powered by oxygen, traces back to those ancient bacterial cells floating in the Archean seas. They set the pattern for life's metabolism, one that has never changed. The act of breathing, intake, exchange, release, is a ritual that began billions of years ago with microbes learning to use light. The legacy of those architects still surrounds us. Cyanobacteria exist in almost every habitat on Earth today. In oceans, lakes, soils, deserts, even in the crust of rocks. Some species form mats on polar ice, others live in the roots of plants, and a few float freely in the open sea, producing nearly half of the oxygen in our atmosphere. Each time you inhale, a measurable fraction of that air came from the descendants of the same organisms that first built it. The continuity is almost complete. Over geological time, the atmosphere stabilised at levels where oxygen made up about 1/5 of the air. That balance has held remarkably steady for hundreds of millions of years, regulated by the ongoing dance of photosynthesis and respiration. When forests grow and plankton bloom, oxygen rises. When organic matter decays or burns, it falls. Yet it never strays far, as though the planet itself remembers its equilibrium. That stability is part of what makes Earth habitable, a balance first achieved by microbes who never knew balance was even possible. And while their influence was global, their world was still microscopic. To the human eye, it would have seemed unchanged. The oceans continued to shimmer, the tides to rise and fall, and the continents to drift. But under that calm surface, evolution was working quietly, preparing for the next great experiment. Some of the larger single-celled organisms began forming partnerships, clustering together, dividing labour, sharing nutrients. Cooperation was becoming structure. The world of the invisible was preparing to give rise to the visible. Yet, even as new forms of life began to appear, the microbial architects never relinquished their rule. They simply receded into the background, supporting everything else from below. You can still see their ancient handiwork in the geological record and in the modern world. The oxygen we breathe, the rust-coloured rocks on distant cliffs, the ozone that shields us from radiation, all are monuments to their reign. Their success wasn't built on speed or strength or intellect. It was built on persistence, patience, and the simple act of existing in harmony with energy itself. They turned light into life, and in doing so, wrote the rules of the biosphere. Every ecosystem that came afterward followed those rules. The rise of oxygen marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. For billions of years, life had been confined to the ocean depths, shielded from the sun's radiation by layers of water. Now, with an ozone layer in place and breathable air forming, the surface of the continents was becoming less hostile. The conditions that would one day allow plants to grow and animals to walk were beginning to take shape, but evolution doesn't hurry. For hundreds of millions of years after the Great Oxidation, the planet remained mostly microbial. The oceans were still the centre of life, their chemistry slowly adjusting to the new balance. Only when the atmosphere and the oceans settled into equilibrium would the next wave of complexity begin to emerge. It's tempting to imagine the Earth as a grand laboratory, each era a new experiment in what life can do. The microbial age was its foundation, and oxygen was its most transformative experiment. It changed not only the chemistry of the world, but also its rhythm, the way carbon, nitrogen, and energy flowed. From that point on, life and atmosphere would evolve together, each shaping the other in an endless dialogue. If you stand outside on a clear day and look at the sky, you're seeing the direct legacy of those tiny architects. The air itself is their monument, vast yet delicate, invisible yet essential. Every cloud that drifts, every storm that forms, every flame that burns does so because of them. The blue above you is the light scattered by oxygen molecules they made. The same molecules fill your lungs as you breathe, linking you directly to that ancient ocean where their work began. The rule of the microbial architects never ended, it simply expanded. Their descendants live in symbiosis with plants, embedded in leaves and roots, continuing the exchange of gases they began. In the sea, plankton blooms still rise and fall with the seasons, echoing the pulse of their ancient ancestors. The oxygen cycle they created is now the heartbeat of the planet. And though new forms of life were waiting in the wings, preparing to move, swim, and eventually walk, they would all depend on what had already been built. The groundwork was laid, the air prepared, the chemistry balanced. The world was ready for complexity. In the shallows of the ocean, something was stirring again, larger cells joining into simple bodies, tissues forming, patterns emerging. Life was about to step from the invisible to the visible. The microbial age, though eternal in influence, had set the stage for a new kind of rule. The seas would no longer be silent. Movement would return, shapes would shift, and the next wave of Earth's rulers would begin to rise from the green-lit depths where oxygen first met light. The world that followed the rise of oxygen was both familiar and alien. The air was cleaner, the sky brighter, and the oceans rich with new chemistry. But there were no trees along the shorelines, no birds in the sky, no footprints in the mud. The continents were barren, scorched by sunlight, their surfaces rough with rock and dust. All life still belonged to the sea. It was there, in the water's quiet depths, that the next age of the Earth unfolded, an age of silence, when life began to take shape but sound had not yet found a reason to exist. The ocean stretched vast and unbroken, their colours changing from green to blue as oxygen spread through their depths. Sunlight filtered down in dim layers, fading into darkness that no eye could yet see. There were no coral reefs, no schools of fish, no flickers of movement to break the stillness. And yet, life was everywhere, invisible to the naked eye, but abundant beyond imagination. The surface waters teemed with microscopic plankton, tiny drifters that floated where currents carried them. In the shallows, mats of microbial life clung to rocks, forming soft carpets that rippled when touched by waves. Beneath this quiet surface, a slow revolution was taking place. For billions of years, life had existed as single cells. It had mastered chemistry, learned to breathe, learned to capture light, but it had not yet learned form. Now, for reasons still debated, cells began to join forces. They didn't merge completely, but they stayed together after dividing, forming clusters that acted as a single unit. These simple colonies were the first step toward multicellular life. It was a small change in appearance, but a vast leap in potential. Working together allowed these cells to specialize. Some took in nutrients, others handled movement or protection. The cooperation that began in these colonies would eventually lead to bodies, organized, structured, and capable of complex behavior. But for now, those first experiments were still crude. They drifted through the seas like soft threads or flattened discs, fragile and slow. The ocean around them was silent, but full of possibility. This was the world of the Proterozoic eon, a time that lasted nearly 2 billion years. The Earth was older now, its continents stable, its climate oscillating between warmth and deep freeze. Glaciers sometimes advanced to the equator, covering the planet in ice from pole to pole. These Snowball Earth periods were harsh beyond measure, but they never lasted forever. Volcanic gases eventually warmed the planet again, melting the ice and flooding the oceans with nutrients. Each cycle of freeze and thaw left the seas richer and life more resilient. When the ice retreated, oxygen spread even deeper. New ecosystems began to emerge in the dim light of the continental shelves. The first truly complex organisms appeared. Soft-bodied creatures with no bones, no shells, and no eyes, but with symmetry, tissues, and patterns. We know them today through rare fossils that capture the impressions of their bodies pressed into ancient mud. They look nothing like the animals we know now. Some resembled fronds of seaweed, standing upright in the current. Others looked like flattened discs, quilted with gentle ridges. A few sprawled like mats, their outlines impossible to define. Scientists call them the Ediacaran biota, the first macroscopic life forms to populate the Earth. These creatures lived slowly. They absorbed nutrients directly from the water or from the microbial mats beneath them. There were no predators yet, no chasing, no hiding. The seas were peaceful, almost meditative in their rhythm. Day and night passed with the cycles of light. But the inhabitants of this world had no eyes to see them, no ears to hear the tides, no nervous systems to feel fear or hunger as we understand it. They existed in a world without conflict. It's difficult to imagine such a place, an ecosystem where everything lives but nothing hunts. Each organism grew as large as its environment allowed, unchallenged and undisturbed. Some reached sizes of a metre or more, lying like vast leaves upon the seafloor. Others clung to sediment surfaces, anchored by nothing more than their own weight. If you could drift through those ancient seas, you'd see landscapes of soft shapes, swaying gently, like an underwater meadow without colour or sound. The simplicity of that world was deceptive. Beneath the surface calm, evolution was experimenting. The new multicellular designs were testing what life could be. Some groups developed internal cavities to increase surface area for feeding. Others began to fold their bodies, forming primitive digestive spaces. The groundwork for muscles, nerves, and organs was being laid in these simple forms. Each one represented a new possibility. Not all of them succeeded. Many of the early body plans vanished completely, leaving behind no descendants. Others evolved into forms we might recognize as distant cousins of animals today. Sponges, for example, may trace their lineage back to this time. They are still among the simplest multicellular organisms, structures of cells that work together to pump water, filter nutrients, and sustain themselves without movement or a central brain. Even in modern oceans, they remain living echoes of that silent era. While life explored complexity, the Earth itself continued to change. The continents drifted slowly, colliding and breaking apart in endless cycles. Mountains rose and wore down. Volcanic eruptions released gases that altered the climate, sometimes warming, sometimes cooling. The seas rose and fell. Through it all, the biosphere adapted, never losing its grip on the planet. Life had become resilient enough to survive global catastrophes. The chemistry of the oceans was also shifting. Oxygen, once confined to surface waters, penetrated deeper. Iron and sulfur compounds that had coloured the water for eons began to settle out. The seas cleared. For the first time, sunlight reached farther below the surface, illuminating habitats that had once been cloaked in perpetual darkness. New forms of photosynthetic life took advantage of it, expanding the food web and providing energy for more complex organisms. Still, the pace of change was slow. The world of the Ediacaran remained quiet for millions upon millions of years. There were no sudden bursts of activity, no competition for space, no movement to stir the sediment. It was a world defined by stillness and time. But even in stillness, life was preparing for its next transformation. Eventually, some organisms began to develop the ability to move. At first, it was barely perceptible. A ripple, a shifting of cells, a slow glide across the sea floor. But it was enough to mark a turning point. Movement opened new possibilities. It allowed creatures to explore, to seek nutrients rather than wait for them. It also introduced the potential for interaction, and later for predation. The quiet order of the Ediacaran seas would not last forever. Before movement became common, however, life had to solve a fundamental problem: how to coordinate. For a multicellular organism to move, its cells must act together. That required communication, and communication required a system, a network capable of transmitting signals quickly. The earliest forms of this were chemical, molecules passing from one cell to another. Over time, these signals became more specialized, paving the way for what we now call nerves. The first faint sparks of sensation were beginning to flicker in the dark. While those early systems were evolving, the environment continued to shape life's direction. The nutrients released by glaciers and volcanoes fueled vast blooms of plankton. These blooms increased oxygen production further, creating new ecological layers in the ocean. The deeper regions remained low in oxygen, home to anaerobic microbes that had survived from earlier ages. The upper layers, rich in oxygen and sunlight, became havens for the new multicellular forms. This stratification set the stage for the ecosystems we know today, different worlds stacked within the same sea. The transition from microbial mats to soft-bodied animals was not a single event, but a gradual unfolding. Each generation built upon the structures of the last. Genetic complexity increased. The language of DNA grew more elaborate, allowing more precise control of shape and function. With each step, life's potential expanded, and though it all remained silent, the foundation for future diversity was forming. Fossils from this period are rare, preserved only in special conditions where soft bodies left impressions in fine sediments. These impressions are delicate, ghostly outlines that reveal just enough to spark curiosity. Some look like ferns, though they weren't plants. Others appear radial, like flowers, though they had no petals or stems. They were organisms experimenting with geometry, symmetry, and design. Their world was like a biological rehearsal, a preview of what evolution was capable of before it decided on the forms we know. If you could stand on the ancient seabed and watch the slow movement of currents over these creatures, it would feel peaceful, almost timeless. The only sounds would be the distant rumble of underwater volcanoes and the soft shifting of sediment. The light would fade as you descended, turning green, then blue, then black. The deeper you went, the more ancient it felt. Down there, in the stillness, the last survivors of the old microbial world thrived, feeding on chemical energy instead of sunlight. They were reminders that even as new life rose, the first life still endured. It's remarkable that all of this existed without eyes to witness it. Light had filled the world for billions of years before any creature could see it. The first forms of photoreception, cells sensitive to brightness, wouldn't appear until much later. In the age of the silent seas, there was no awareness, no distinction between day and night. The cycles of the world passed unnoticed by the organisms living within them, and yet each cycle brought subtle change. Each change nudged evolution forward. Slowly, the building blocks of future animals were taking shape. Collagen, the protein that gives structure to tissues, genes that controlled development, patterns of symmetry that defined front and back, top and bottom. These innovations were the seeds from which the diversity of later life would grow. Every heartbeat, every nervous impulse, every moving muscle traces its ancestry to that silent era when the groundwork of animal biology was laid. As the Proterozoic drew toward its end, the stage was set for something extraordinary. Oxygen levels were high, nutrients abundant, and the climate stable. The experiments of multicellularity had been running for hundreds of millions of years. Somewhere, perhaps in a quiet lagoon or a deep oxygen-rich basin, a new kind of creature was evolving, one with muscles that could contract, a body that could move with purpose, and a mouth that could feed. The silence of the seas was about to be broken, but in that final stretch before motion began, the Earth enjoyed one last age of stillness. The balance between simplicity and complexity held firm. The oceans glowed faintly under the light of a younger sun. Microbial mats rippled beneath the surface. The strange quilted creatures of the seafloor swayed in gentle currents. It was a world entirely unlike ours, yet utterly alive. This was the planet's great pause before its next burst of creativity. Life had learned how to build itself. Soon, it would learn how to move, how to sense, and how to act. But for now, the seas remained quiet, their silence carrying the weight of billions of years of preparation. If you could listen closely enough, perhaps there would be a sound after all, not in the sense of waves or cries, but in the rhythm of existence itself. The silent pulse of evolution, working patiently, waiting for the moment when life would awaken to motion. The ocean was ready. The next rulers were almost here. And in that hush, the earth held its breath, knowing that the stillness would not last much longer. Beneath the calm surface, something was stirring. tiny muscles contracting for the first time, tiny bodies shifting toward purpose. The era of motion, of hunting and fleeing was beginning to form in the depths. The silent seas would soon give way to a world that could move. When the seas had learned to move and life had begun to flex its first muscles, the surface of the earth was still a silent expanse of rock and wind. The continents were bare, sun-bleached, and scarred by erosion. The only colour came from minerals in the soil or the faint sheen of microbial films clinging to damp stone. But deep in the ocean, where light faded and currents shifted across the continental shelves, something was changing again. The same forces that had taught life to move were now preparing it to grow toward the light. This was the beginning of the world's next transformation, the slow conquest of the land, and the rise of the colour green. For billions of years, life had depended on the ocean. Water was its cradle, its shield, and its only home. Every chemical reaction, every cell, every breath of oxygen happened within that liquid world. But oxygen itself was rewriting the planet's possibilities. With a stable atmosphere and an ozone layer that softened the sun's deadly radiation, the surface of the continents was no longer a death zone. It was open ground waiting to be colonised. And though the first steps would be microscopic, their consequences would echo through every future age. The story of green begins not with trees or grass or even moss, but with single-celled organisms floating in the sea, the ancestors of algae and plants. They were photosynthetic, descended from those early cyanobacteria that had filled the atmosphere with oxygen. But unlike their bacterial cousins, these new cells had become more complex. They were eukaryotes, cells with internal compartments, each carrying tiny chloroplasts that traced their lineage back to ancient symbiotic bacteria. Inside those chloroplasts, sunlight was turned into energy, and energy into life. These early algae didn't yet know the concept of land, but they changed everything about the oceans. They formed massive blooms, turning vast stretches of water green. They fed entire food webs, releasing oxygen and organic matter that nourished other organisms. The chemistry of the sea became richer, more layered, more alive. And slowly, over hundreds of millions of years, some of these algae began to adapt to shallow coastal environments where waves met stone and where water levels rose and fell with the tides. In these intertidal zones, life encountered both opportunity and danger. Exposure to air brought access to new light and carbon dioxide, but also risk. The drying heat of the sun, the absence of buoyant support, and the relentless pounding of waves. The organisms that survived here had to adapt in extraordinary ways. Some developed protective coatings to prevent desiccation. Others strengthened their cell walls or formed simple root-like filaments that anchored them to rock. Each adaptation brought them one step closer to surviving outside the ocean's constant embrace. It's hard to overstate the significance of that transition. The moment life began to stabilize itself against air and dryness, the very definition of the biosphere expanded. For the first time, biology was no longer confined to the sea. The thin line between ocean and continent had become a zone of innovation, a border where evolution could experiment freely, and it did, endlessly. The earliest pioneers were not yet plants as we know them. They were simple green films and mats, microbial communities and filamentous algae that could tolerate intermittent drying. They clung to the edges of tidal flats and salt marshes, surviving between floods. Each cycle of tide and drought selected the strongest, those with chemistry capable of holding moisture, repairing damage, and restarting metabolism after exposure. These were the first hints of what would one day become roots, stems, and leaves. As they spread, they changed the land itself. Their presence slowed erosion, trapped sediments, and began to create the first soils. Until then, land had been shaped only by physical forces, wind, water, and heat. Now, biology entered the equation. The interaction between living mats and rock began producing organic material that held moisture and nutrients. The surface of the continent started to darken. the barren world was very slowly turning fertile. This transformation was not fast. Millions of years passed before true plants appeared, and even longer before they grew large enough to alter the landscape. But the groundwork was being laid in these thin green threads creeping across shorelines and riverbeds. Their evolution was driven by necessity. Water, once abundant everywhere, was now a scarce and precious resource outside the ocean. To survive on land, organisms needed new systems, ways to transport water internally, protect themselves from drying, and reproduce without relying on currents. Some of the first to attempt this were the ancestors of modern liverworts and mosses. These small, soft plants likely appeared around 470 million years ago, during a period when the continents were still largely barren. They lacked roots and stems in the modern sense, but they had structures that performed similar roles. They absorbed water directly through their surfaces and anchored themselves with fine threads called rhizoids. Their tissues were simple, yet astonishingly effective. When these primitive plants began to spread inland, they set off one of the most profound environmental changes in Earth's history. For the first time, green life covered rock, capturing sunlight directly on land. This not only increased oxygen production, but also accelerated the weathering of minerals. As plants released organic acids through their rhizoids, they broke down rocks faster, freeing nutrients like phosphorus and calcium. These nutrients washed into rivers and eventually into the sea, fueling even more biological productivity. The Earth's cycles were becoming tightly interconnected, with land and ocean feeding one another. The appearance of plants also began to affect the climate. Their photosynthesis drew down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, reducing the greenhouse effect and cooling the planet. The result may have been the Ordovician glaciations, periods of widespread ice that reshaped the continents. But even as the climate fluctuated, plants continued to spread. Each generation reached a little farther inland. Each adaptation made them a little stronger. Soon, some developed vascular tissues, tiny tubes that could transport water and nutrients internally. This innovation freed them from the limits of surface absorption and allowed them to grow taller. These early vascular plants, like Cooksonia, were small by modern standards, only a few centimetres high, but they represented a revolutionary idea: verticality. For the first time, life reached upward, toward the sky. The world that had been flat and low began to acquire height and structure. As plants grew taller, they cast shadows, creating micro-environments where moisture lingered and temperatures stayed cooler. These pockets of shade provided shelter for other organisms, fungi, small arthropods and microbes that followed plants onto land. The first ecosystems were forming on the continents, small but complex networks of interaction. Fungi formed symbiotic relationships with plant roots, exchanging nutrients and helping them absorb minerals. These partnerships, known as mycorrhizae, still exist today and remain essential for most plant species. The rise of plants also transformed the atmosphere in ways that would echo through every later age. As green life expanded, oxygen levels climbed again, while carbon dioxide fell. The air grew cooler, clearer, and more stable. This shift created feedback loops that reinforced plant growth. Cooler temperatures slowed decay, allowing more organic matter to accumulate in soils, which in turn provided richer ground for further colonization. The Earth was learning to sustain itself through biological regulation. At the same time, plants were experimenting with reproduction. In the water, fertilization was simple. Cells could drift and meet freely. On land, the problem was far more complex. Some early plants continued to rely on water films, reproducing only when rain or floods provided temporary pools. But evolution soon found solutions. Spores developed tough coatings to resist drying, allowing them to survive until conditions were right. Later, as plants diversified, seeds and pollen would take that idea further, enabling reproduction across vast distances without dependence on liquid water. It's easy to imagine the first landscapes that resulted from this green expansion. Low mats of moss-like plants hugging the ground, thin stalks rising sporadically like miniature forests, and stretches of bare rock between them. Over time, these patches connected, forming continuous carpets of vegetation. Streams began to meander through soft soils rather than bare stone. When rain fell, it no longer washed everything away. The plants held the earth together. The sound of rainfall on vegetation, a sound that defines life today, was born in this era. As the continents greened, they began to influence the ocean in new ways. Rivers carried organic matter into coastal waters, feeding marine ecosystems. The balance between land and sea became dynamic, a conversation between two halves of the biosphere. The oxygen produced by plants supported new forms of animal life underwater, while the nutrients from land fueled further photosynthesis in the sea. The Great Green Revolution was not just a conquest of land, it was a reorganization of the entire planet's systems. Over millions of years, plants grew more diverse and complex. Some developed true leaves to increase the surface area for photosynthesis. Others evolved stronger stems to support larger structures. By the late Silurian and early Devonian periods, around 420 million years ago, the first small forests had appeared. They weren't forests as we know them, more like thickets of waist-high plants, but they changed everything. They captured more carbon, stabilized soils, and created new habitats for early animals venturing onto land. Among those early colonists were arthropods, ancestors of insects and spiders, that found shelter and food among the greenery. They grazed on decaying plant matter, pollinated primitive spores, and began forming the first food chains on land. With them came the first true soil ecosystems, where life decomposed life, recycling nutrients in a never-ending cycle. The partnership between plants and animals deepened over time. The oxygen-rich atmosphere they created allowed animals to grow larger and more active. In turn, the movement of animals spread spores and seeds, accelerating plant distribution. The two groups evolved together, each shaping the other's destiny. Meanwhile, the world's climate continued to respond to the spread of vegetation. As plants pulled carbon dioxide from the air, global temperatures dropped further and glaciers expanded. The balance between photosynthesis and respiration became one of the main regulators of climate. Even now, hundreds of millions of years later, that balance remains at the heart of Earth's stability. The physical appearance of the planet was utterly transformed. Where once there had been only rock, now there were valleys of green. Rivers meandered between vegetated banks. Hills were covered in moss, ferns, and early shrubs. From above, the continents would have appeared alive for the first time, breathing in carbon and exhaling oxygen. The sound of wind through leaves, though still faint and sparse, would have been the first whisper of the landscapes we now take for granted. The Great Green Revolution did more than change the surface of the planet. It changed the flow of energy through it. Before plants, the primary producers were confined to the ocean, and the bulk of life depended on marine ecosystems. With plants established on land, sunlight could be captured over continents as well. This increased the total productivity of the biosphere, paving the way for more complex food webs and higher biodiversity. Even the appearance of colour in nature was transformed. Chlorophyll had already made the oceans green, but on land, it painted entire landscapes in hues of emerald and jade. Over time, as flowers and fruits evolved, new pigments would follow, but green was the first true colour of life on land, a sign that the planet had awakened in full. The process was slow, but irreversible. Each generation of plants pushed farther inland, each root dug deeper, each spore travelled wider. Evolution had found a new frontier and it would never let go. The air grew fresher, the soils thicker, and the continents more alive. But the spread of plants also brought challenges. As vegetation covered more of the land, it drew down carbon dioxide so effectively that the planet risked entering extended cold periods. Ice advanced again in some epochs, threatening to undo the progress of green life, yet plants adapted. They developed mechanisms to conserve water, to survive drought, to grow in poor soils. Their diversity became their strength. By the late Devonian, forests of tall trees had appeared. These giants, like Archaeopteris, towered up to 30 meters high, their branches forming dense canopies that shaded the ground below. Beneath them, the first complex terrestrial ecosystems flourished. The world had entered a new era, one defined by oxygen, stability, and abundance. If you could stand in one of those early forests, you would feel the air heavy with moisture and rich with oxygen. The ground would be soft with decaying leaves and roots. Strange insects would crawl along the bark, and the only sounds would be wind and the faint dripping of water. It was a peaceful, humid world, but also a powerful one. For the first time, life had truly mastered the land, and while plants ruled above, their influence reached below. As roots penetrated deeper, they altered the geology of the planet, breaking apart rocks and releasing minerals that changed ocean chemistry once again. Erosion increased, nutrient cycles accelerated, and sediments rich in organic matter built up along coasts. The Earth's crust, atmosphere, and biosphere were now inseparable, bound together in feedback systems that define the planet as living. The Great Green Revolution was more than a biological event. It was the moment when the planet began to breathe in harmony. Plants were not just inhabitants, they were regulators, architects, and sustainers. They cooled the world, fed its creatures, and created the conditions that would one day allow animals, including us, to thrive. As the forests spread and life grew more intricate, new players began to emerge from the sea, creatures that had watched the land from afar and were now ready to follow the path the plants had opened. They would crawl onto the damp shores, their bodies still half made for swimming, half for walking. The world of green had prepared the way, and the next great chapter of life's story was ready to unfold. The continents, once barren and silent, had become places of colour and motion. The air shimmered with oxygen, the rivers carried life in every drop, and the seas were still connected to everything through the rhythm of evaporation and rain. The planet had remade itself yet again, this time through the patience of small green things reaching slowly toward the sun. And as their roots deepened and their leaves spread, the stage was set for a new kind of ruler, creatures that would take their first uncertain steps onto land, following the trail of the Great Green Revolution into a world that was no longer just for the sea. The seas that followed the greening of the continents were alive with light. The sun, filtered through water now clearer than it had ever been, poured across the shallow shelves that rimmed the young continents. Oxygen filled the depths where darkness once reigned, and nutrients from newly vegetated land washed into the sea, feeding life in endless forms. What had once been a quiet realm of drifting mats and soft, motionless creatures was now stirring. The age of stillness had ended. The age of motion had begun. In this new oceanic world, bodies were taking shape in ways never seen before. Cells that had once lived in loose colonies were organising into tissues, muscles, and organs. Structures that could bend, contract, and propel were forming in the dark. For the first time, creatures could swim, crawl, and hunt. It was a revolution in behaviour as much as in biology. The seas became theatres of motion, filled with soft bodies gliding through water, their forms alien and fluid. These early animals had no bones, no shells, no armour to protect them. Their skeletons were made of water and muscle, their shapes maintained by the pressure of their own bodies. Yet they grew large, some longer than a human, some wider than a man's reach. In a world that had never seen predators or prey, size itself was power. They drifted like living veils, pulsing softly through the currents, their translucent bodies shimmering with internal light. Among the first to dominate this new world were the jellyfish and their relatives. Their design was astonishingly simple, a soft bell of tissue that contracted rhythmically, pushing them through water, with trailing tentacles that captured food. They had no brains, no bones, and no central organs, yet their movements were purposeful, graceful, and effective. Their nerves formed loose networks that allowed them to sense changes in light, touch, and chemical gradients. In the vastness of the ancient ocean, they were among the earliest masters of motion. To modernise, the Cambrian seas would seem both beautiful and unsettling. Transparent bodies drifted like ghosts, their edges dissolving into the light. Ribbon-like worms undulated across the sediment, leaving trails that would one day fossilise into the first signs of active life. Some creatures dug burrows for shelter, reshaping the sea floor as they moved. Others floated near the surface, absorbing sunlight or feeding on microscopic plankton. Everywhere, life was trying new forms, experimenting with what it meant to be alive in motion. This explosion of diversity has come to be known as the Cambrian explosion. Not an instant burst, but a gradual flowering over tens of millions of years. In that span, nearly every major body plan found in animals today emerged for the first time. The genetic toolkit that shaped eyes, limbs, and skeletons was written in this period. But the earliest players of this drama had none of those features yet. They ruled through softness, through adaptation, through resilience. Some of these soft-bodied rulers were strange beyond imagination. One, known to science as Anomalocaris, swam like a ribbon of muscle, its mouth a circular array of plates that could crush its prey. It was a predator, perhaps the first large one in history. Yet even it had no bones, no internal framework, only layers of tissue powered by water pressure and precision. Others, like Hallucigenia, walked on spindly legs tipped with claws, its back lined with defensive spines. These designs seem bizarre now, but they were the raw experiments of evolution testing new ideas. Everywhere in these seas, new senses were awakening. Eyes appeared in primitive forms, simple light-sensitive patches that detected brightness, then more complex lenses that could focus. For the first time, creatures could perceive distance, direction, and movement. With sight came awareness, and with awareness came the first true predator-prey relationships. The quiet harmony of the ancient seas fractured into a dynamic balance of pursuit and escape. The sediments of Cambrian oceans tell the story clearly. Burrows and tracks that had once been rare became abundant. The sea floor was no longer a flat sheet of microbial mats. It was churned and sculpted by the movements of animals. The invention of mobility changed everything. Creatures could now exploit resources over wider areas, find mates, and avoid danger. They could also disturb the environment itself, mixing oxygen into deeper layers of sediment and transforming the chemistry of the ocean floor. For the first time, life was shaping not just the surface of the planet, but its structure. The boundaries between living and non-living blurred further. The seas became ecosystems of astonishing complexity, each layer dependent on the others. Microbes still ruled invisibly, recycling nutrients and producing oxygen, but they now shared their world with larger, more active beings. The absence of bones didn't limit these creatures. In many ways, it freed them. Without rigid structures, they could bend, twist, and grow in any direction. Some evolved radial symmetry, like starbursts of soft tissue radiating from a central point. Others developed long, flexible bodies that could burrow or swim with serpentine grace. Jellyfish pulsated in open water while sea anemones anchored themselves to rocks, capturing food with stinging tentacles. These designs proved so successful that their descendants still inhabit every ocean today, virtually unchanged. It's strange to imagine a world ruled by beings without structure, without skeletons or shells, yet their dominance lasted millions of years. They were the giants of their age, filling every niche before harder-bodied creatures evolved to compete. Their rule was not one of conquest, but of adaptation. They flowed through their environment, merging with it, shaped by it as much as they shaped it. As oxygen levels rose further, larger bodies became possible. The chemistry of the ocean allowed for more efficient metabolism, giving these creatures the energy to grow and move more actively. The first food webs took form, tiny plankton eaten by small filter feeders, which in turn were hunted by larger swimmers. The balance of life became intricate, interwoven, dynamic. Soft-bodied worms, the ancestors of many modern groups, were among the most numerous. They tunneled through mud, aerating the seafloor and releasing nutrients back into circulation. Their activity transformed the ocean floor into a living, breathing system. Some developed bristles or simple appendages for movement. Others evolved specialized mouths for scraping or filtering food. These unassuming creatures became the engineers of their ecosystems, turning static sediments into habitats rich with life. At the same time, more complex feeding strategies emerged. Some animals filtered plankton from the water using delicate tentacles, while others grazed on microbial mats. Predators evolved specialized appendages for grasping, tearing, or suction. The interactions between these forms drove evolution at a faster pace than ever before. Every innovation demanded a counter-innovation. Speed required agility. Protection required offense. Complexity begot complexity. And yet, through all this change, the ocean remained a place of silence. There were no vocal cords, no calls or songs. The communication of these early creatures was chemical, tactile, and visual. They sensed vibrations in the water, detected the faintest shifts in light, and responded to the subtle gradients of molecules drifting through the sea. It was a language of impulses, not words, a network of responses as old as life itself. Fossil sites like the Burgess Shale in Canada preserve these ancient scenes in extraordinary detail. There, creatures that once swam in the Cambrian seas were buried quickly under fine sediment, leaving impressions of their soft tissues. Some look like delicate lace, others like folded ribbons. Their diversity is breathtaking. In those rocks, we see the earliest record of nervous systems, muscles, eyes, and organs. Every modern animal lineage traces its ancestry back to that proliferation of forms. The giants of this age did not build bones, but they built possibilities. The flexible architectures of their bodies laid the groundwork for later creatures to evolve rigid frameworks. The soft tissues that once moved independently became anchored to cartilage and eventually bone. The nervous systems that once controlled simple reflexes grew into the foundations of intelligence. Their contributions were invisible in stone, but permanent in lineage. Even as these early animals flourished, they were vulnerable. Softness offered mobility, but little defense. When hard shells evolved, first as simple protective coatings made of calcium carbonate, the balance began to shift. Predators with teeth-like structures could crush their prey. The arms race between hardness and softness began, reshaping the ocean's hierarchy. The era of the giants without bones would eventually give way to a new age dominated by armour and skeletons. But for millions of years, before shells filled the fossil record, it was these soft beings who ruled the sea. Their world was fluid and changing. The currents carried larvae to new habitats. The tides shifted sediments, burying the remains of each generation. Storms stirred the depths, spreading nutrients and resetting the balance. Life responded in kind, adapting ceaselessly, growing where it could, retreating when it must. Evolution was not a straight path, but a conversation between organism and environment. Each success altered the world in subtle ways, making room for the next experiment. If you could descend into those ancient waters, you might feel as if you had entered a dreamscape. The light would shimmer through bodies so translucent you could see their organs pulsing inside. Jellyfish the size of dinner plates would drift past, their tentacles trailing like silk ribbons. Flatworms, iridescent under the filtered sun, would ripple across the sand. In the distance, ribbon-like predators would glide silently, their bodies bending with perfect coordination. There would be no sound but the hum of the water itself. No roar or cry, only the faint rhythm of movement. The oceans of this era were unlike any that came after. They were warm, shallow, and oxygen-rich, ideal for experimentation. The diversity of forms exploded in every direction. Nature was trying every design imaginable: spikes, frills, tentacles, lobes, eyes on stalks, bodies shaped like cones, ribbons, spirals, and discs. Many of these designs failed, disappearing after a few million years, but each one contributed to the growing library of life's possibilities. As the Cambrian period gave way to the Ordovician, the seas grew even more vibrant. New types of organisms appeared: sponges, corals, and early mollusks. The first reef systems began to form, built not by hard coral skeletons, but by microbial and sponge-like structures. These reefs became centres of biodiversity, gathering life in dense, layered communities. Above them, soft-bodied swimmers continued their rule, gliding through water filled with drifting plankton. The balance between the green world above and the blue world below deepened further. Plants on land continued to pump oxygen into the air, and the oceans absorbed it, fueling the metabolism of these boneless giants. In return, the marine world helped regulate the planet's carbon cycle, burying organic matter in sediments that would one day become stone. The planet's living systems had become inseparable, intertwined in feedback loops that spanned continents and eons. Even as creatures evolved shells and exoskeletons, the soft-body lineage persisted. Jellyfish, sponges, and worms never disappeared. They had already perfected a way of life so efficient that no replacement was necessary. To this day, they remain, living fossils of the earliest age of complexity. When you watch a jellyfish drift in the ocean, you are seeing a survivor of that world, a being whose ancestors ruled before bones existed, before vertebrates had even formed. The story of this age is not one of extinction, but of transformation. The soft gave rise to the hard, the simple to the complex. The foundation of animal diversity was built here, in the silent seas of the Cambrian and Ordovician, by creatures that left few bones but infinite influence. Their legacy is in the architecture of life itself, the muscles that move, the nerves that sense, the eyes that see. The giants without bones ruled in silence, and when they passed their crown to new rulers with skeletons and shells, they did so without protest. The world they had built was ready for new experiments. The seas were crowded, the reefs vibrant, and the currents rich with food. Soon, creatures with armour would emerge, with jaws, fins, and hard parts that could withstand the weight of evolution's demands. But even then, the soft ones would remain, gliding through the water as they always had, reminders of a time when life was nothing but muscle, light, and motion. The ocean would never forget them, because it still carries their rhythm, the slow pulse of existence, the first breath of movement, the endless dance of creatures made entirely of living water. And as the light faded across those ancient seas, the next rulers were already stirring, armoured and ready to take the stage, bringing with them a new chapter in the story of life, one where the balance between strength and softness would forever define the shape of the living world. The world that followed the reign of the boneless giants was a place of colour and abundance. The oceans had grown rich, layered with life from surface to depth. Reefs shimmered in the shallows, home to creatures with shells, exoskeletons and eyes that could now see with startling clarity. The soft-bodied rulers had not vanished, but they shared the water with new designs. Harder, faster, sharper. The seas had become crowded with possibility. Yet above them, the continents still waited, vast and mostly lifeless. The wind swept across plains of stone and soil, over mosses and small green plants that clung to the damp edges of rivers. Life had conquered the oceans, but the land remained the last frontier, and slowly, cautiously, creatures began to cross it. It's difficult to imagine the courage, if we can call it that, of those first pioneers. They didn't plan or intend to leave the water. They followed food, warmth, safety, whatever small gradient of survival pushed them forward, but in doing so they became the first animals to set their bodies against the air. The story of life on land did not begin with a single bold leap, but with countless small crawls. The first explorers were likely invertebrates, arthropods, the lineage that had already mastered the art of armour. Their hard exoskeletons gave them structure and protection. Their jointed legs gave them mobility, and their ability to breathe through tubes or gills allowed them to exploit shallow waters and tidal zones. Some species of ancient millipedes, centipedes, and scorpion-like creatures crept from tidal flats onto damp shorelines, feeding on decaying plant matter and microbial mats. Their ancestors had scuttled across seafloors for millions of years, and the land was only another surface. The continents at this time were nothing like the ones we know. There were no grasses, no trees, only low mats of mosses, liverworts, and primitive vascular plants. Rivers meandered through barren landscapes, carrying sediment into shallow deltas. The air was thick with carbon dioxide, humid and heavy, and the ground was coated in fine, nutrient-rich dust. For the arthropods, this was a paradise of unclaimed resources. There were no predators on land, no competition, and plenty to eat. The transition from water to land required more than courage. It required invention. Gills, efficient in the water, collapsed in air. Bodies designed to float had to bear their own weight. Movement through liquid became clumsy on solid ground. But evolution is nothing if not patient. Many of these challenges were solved not in a single step, but through a gradient of habitats, mud flats, mangrove-like shallows, and tidal pools that alternated between wet and dry. In these places, creatures evolved to breathe air for short periods, to crawl over submerged rocks, to rest in moist burrows when the tide fell. Over generations, these small adaptations became permanent. Some of the earliest land animals were the eurypterids, or sea scorpions. They were enormous compared to most modern arthropods, some reaching lengths of 2 meters. Their flattened bodies and strong limbs allowed them to crawl along the seafloor and into shallow lagoons. Fossil tracks show that they occasionally ventured onto land, perhaps to escape predators or to search for new hunting grounds. Their segmented legs left impressions in ancient mud, faint but unmistakable, a record of one of life's greatest thresholds being crossed. Other arthropods followed, primitive insects, centipedes, and early arachnids. These creatures didn't breathe through lungs or gills as we know them, but through small openings called spiracles connected to a network of tubes that delivered air directly to their tissues. It was a brilliant system, simple and efficient, perfect for a world where oxygen was abundant and competition was scarce. On the new continents, they found a landscape of opportunity. In the beginning, they stayed close to the water, never far from the moisture they still needed to survive. But plants were spreading too, moving farther inland, creating pockets of humidity and shade. The partnership between plants and animals deepened. Plants offered shelter and food, while animals helped decompose organic matter, recycling nutrients back into the soil. The first true terrestrial ecosystems were forming, tiny, self-contained worlds of green and movement. The next great wave of colonization came not from the invertebrates, but from the fish. Their ancestors had thrived in the Cambrian and Ordovician seas, evolving jaws, fins and skeletons. By the Devonian period, around 400 million years ago, fish had diversified into countless forms. Some swam in open water, others lived near the bottom, resting among reeds and rocks. Among them were species that could breathe both air and water, using specialized organs that later became lungs. These fish, often called lobe-finned fish, had fleshy, muscular fins supported by bones that were precursors to limbs. They could push themselves along the bottom, propelling their bodies over mud and shallow pools. As the Devonian climate shifted and droughts became more common, some of these fish were forced to survive in temporary ponds that dried up seasonally. The ability to breathe air and move short distances between pools became a matter of life and death. Those that could crawl to new water survived. Those that couldn't perished. Natural selection favoured the strong-finned wanderers. Over millions of years, those fins became more specialised. The bones inside lengthened and articulated, forming structures that could support weight. Muscles grew stronger, and the connection between shoulder and spine evolved to handle movement on land. The transformation was gradual but unstoppable. One generation at a time, life learned to walk. The fossil record preserves some of these transitional forms in exquisite detail. One of the most famous is Tiktaalik, discovered in Arctic rock that was once part of an ancient river delta. It had both gills and lungs, fins with wrist-like joints, and a neck that allowed its head to move independently of its body, a key feature for life on land. It could push itself up, breathe air, and likely hunt in shallow water or along muddy banks. It was not quite a fish, not yet an amphibian, but something in between, the bridge between two worlds. From creatures like Tiktaalik came the first true amphibians. They carried with them the legacy of both sea and land, their lives divided between the two. They laid eggs in water but breathed air. Their skin was thin and moist, absorbing oxygen directly, a reminder of their aquatic ancestry. They moved clumsily at first, dragging their bodies with limbs not yet built for long distances, but they were the first vertebrates to feel the pull of solid earth beneath them. The Devonian landscape must have seemed strange and full of wonder to these early explorers. The air was dense and rich with oxygen. The ground was soft with moss and the decaying remains of plants. Insects buzzed low over the water, and giant millipedes as long as a human arm crawled through the undergrowth. For the first time, the sound of movement echoed through forests that had never known footsteps. The planet's silence was broken by the rustle of limbs against leaves, by the slow exhalation of creatures that had come ashore. This transition didn't happen everywhere at once. The continents were scattered and shaped differently than today, their climates varying from humid tropics to arid plains. In some places, amphibians flourished. In others, they remained trapped near water. The process was one of continual adjustment. Each new species tested the limits of the possible. Some adapted fully to land, others returned to the sea. Evolution moved forward and backward at once, never linear, always experimenting. The consequences of this movement were profound. By entering the land, animals opened an entirely new frontier for life. They became part of the carbon and oxygen cycles in new ways, breathing air directly, influencing plant growth through their activity, and spreading nutrients across ecosystems. The boundary between ocean and continent blurred. The planet was no longer divided between water and stone. It was unified under the banner of life. As amphibians diversified, new forms appeared. Some grew large and powerful, with strong limbs and broad heads. Others remained small, hiding in damp soil or leaf litter. Their diets varied too. Some hunted insects, others fed on small fish or invertebrates. The complexity of food webs increased rapidly, and with it came competition. The land, once empty, became a stage for survival. The amphibians were not alone for long. From among their descendants emerged creatures that would go farther still, animals that could reproduce without returning to the water. The evolution of the amniotic egg, enclosed in a protective membrane, freed them completely from dependence on ponds and streams. These were the first reptiles, and they would go on to dominate the continents for hundreds of millions of years. But before their rise, the amphibians ruled. They were the first to claim the land as their home, the first to breathe freely in air that plants had made possible. It's humbling to think that every step taken by any land creature, including us, traces back to those early crawlers. Their fins became legs, their gills became lungs, their instincts became the foundation of terrestrial life. Each muscle contraction that lifted them from the water was an experiment, a negotiation between two worlds. The success of those experiments changed the planet forever. Even today, echoes of that transition remain. Amphibians still return to water to breed, their lives tied to moisture. Fish, like lungfish, still use both gills and lungs, reminders of the dual existence that once defined the edge of the sea. The genetic blueprints written in that era continue to guide development in every vertebrate embryo, repeating the ancient journey from water to land within the walls of the womb. When you imagine those first animals crawling onto shore, think of the texture of the world they entered. The ground damp with early soil, the air thick with mist, the plants low and dense. Their bodies gleamed in the sunlight, their skin drying too quickly, their movements awkward but determined. Behind them stretched the ocean, vast and eternal, the cradle they could never fully leave behind. Ahead lay a world untouched, waiting to be shaped. Each time a wave receded, some creature followed it. Each time a pond evaporated, a desperate animal dragged itself toward another. There was no grand moment of conquest, no instant transformation. Only persistence, generation after generation, until walking became as natural as swimming once was. Life, in its quiet inevitability, had done what it always does. It found a way. The crawlers did not know that they were changing the course of history. They didn't know that their awkward movements would give rise to mammals, birds, and humans. They were simply surviving, responding to hunger, heat, and drought. Yet from their struggle came everything that would follow. Every forest, every animal, every breath of air taken on land owes its existence to them. And as the amphibians spread, the sounds of the world grew louder. The splash of bodies entering ponds, the rustle of leaves underfoot, the low croaks of primitive calls, all of it new, all of it the music of a living continent. The earth, once silent except for the wind, had found its voice. The shorelines that had once divided life now connected it. The ocean still fed the rivers fed the soil fed the plants, and the plants fed the creatures that walked upon them. The cycle was complete. The planet had become a unified system of water, air, and life, intertwined from seafloor to mountaintop. As the sun set over those ancient wetlands, amphibians rested in the mud, half submerged, their eyes just above the waterline. Behind them, the ocean glimmered under a golden sky. Before them, the land stretched endlessly into the unknown. And somewhere in that stillness the next rulers were already waiting. The reptiles, descendants of the crawlers, ready to take the next step in the long story of the earth. When the amphibians had filled the wetlands and rivers, the earth had already changed beyond recognition. The land was no longer an empty stage. Forests rose across valleys, moss and ferns carpeted the ground, and insects filled the air with a faint hum that broke the ancient silence. The continents were alive, their colours richer than ever before. But life still clung closely to the water. The amphibians, despite their success, were tied to the places where their eggs could stay moist. Every generation still needed ponds, streams, or swamps to complete its cycle. The next great chapter in evolution would belong to those who learned to break that bond, to carry the essence of water within themselves. It began quietly, as most revolutions do. Among the early amphibians, some developed eggs with protective membranes that could resist drying. These were the first amniotes, the ancestors of reptiles, birds, and mammals. Inside those tough shells, embryos floated in small oceans of their own, safe from the air. It was one of life's most ingenious inventions, a simple adjustment that allowed reproduction far from water. With that innovation, the land no longer had limits. The creatures who carried it could travel farther, climb higher, and settle in places where no amphibian could survive. The earliest reptiles were small, nimble creatures, adapted to warmth and dryness. Their skin was thickened with scales that prevented water loss. Their limbs were stronger, their postures sturdier. They could walk with their bellies lifted off the ground, moving faster and with greater endurance than their amphibian cousins. They were no longer prisoners of the swamp. They were free to wander the forests, the hills and the deserts, and as they spread they began to change the balance of the earth again. In the Carboniferous period, when these early reptiles first appeared, the planet was covered in vast tropical forests. Giant ferns and towering lycophytes reached tens of meters high, their trunks hollow and filled with moisture. The air was rich in oxygen, thicker than today, and insects grew enormous. Dragonflies with wingspans as wide as hawks glided through the humid air, and millipedes longer than a man crawled across the forest floor. The reptiles lived among them, small at first, but perfectly adapted to the heat. They fed on insects, small amphibians and each other. They laid their eggs in hidden nests on dry ground, safe from the dangers of drowning or decay. Their bodies, armoured in scales, could endure the sun. While amphibians returned to the water to rest and breed, the reptiles stayed on land, watching over the new empire of green. It was a subtle shift, but an irreversible one. The balance of power was changing. As time passed, the forests grew denser, the swamps deeper, and the reptiles more diverse. Some took to the trees, their limbs becoming agile and their claws sharp. Others remained close to the ground, hunting in leaf litter or hiding among roots. A few evolved into larger, more powerful forms, their jaws lined with teeth built for tearing rather than catching insects. The world had entered an age where strength and endurance mattered as much as adaptability. By the end of the Carboniferous, the climate began to shift. The great tropical forest collapsed, replaced by drier landscapes as global temperatures fell and oxygen levels dropped. Many amphibians struggled with these new conditions, but reptiles thrived. Their physiology allowed them to survive where moisture was scarce. Their eggs did not need to be laid in water, and their lungs were efficient in thin, dry air. They became the dominant vertebrates on land. It was during this time, in the early Permian period, that the reptiles began to divide into major groups. Some developed features that would lead to the ancestors of mammals. These were the synapsids, creatures like Dimetrodon, with its sail-like back supported by long spines. Others evolved into the line that would eventually give rise to dinosaurs, crocodiles, and birds, the diapsids. The competition between these groups shaped the ecosystems of the next 200 million years. The synapsids were among the first to rise to true prominence. They were efficient predators, warm-blooded to a degree, and capable of sustained activity. They dominated the Permian landscapes, hunting herbivorous reptiles and amphibians that still roamed the wetlands. Their skulls were distinctive, with a single temporal opening behind each eye that allowed stronger jaw muscles. This gave them power, endurance, and an advantage in nearly every environment. But evolution never rests on one design for long. The diapsids, with two openings behind each eye, were lighter, faster, and more flexible. They gave rise to an incredible variety of forms: lizards, turtles, early crocodile-like creatures, and the first archosaurs, the ancestors of the dinosaurs. By the late Permian, the Earth was teeming with reptilian life in every shape and size. Some species grazed on plants, others stalked prey with stealth and precision. The reptiles had become true rulers of the land, yet their reign was about to be tested by catastrophe. Around 252 million years ago, the Earth experienced the most devastating mass extinction in its history, the Great Dying. Massive volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia released vast amounts of carbon dioxide, warming the planet and acidifying the oceans. Forests burned, oxygen levels plummeted, and more than 90% of all species vanished. The land grew silent again, its ecosystem shattered. In that silence, only the hardiest survived. Many of the great synapsids perished, their dominance ended in fire and heat. But the diapsids endured. Their adaptability and resilience allowed them to outlast the chaos. When life recovered, it was their descendants who took the stage. From the ashes of extinction rose a new era, the Mesozoic, the true age of reptiles. As the Triassic period began, the world was dry, fragmented, and nearly empty. The supercontinent Pangaea stretched from pole to pole, its interior a vast desert. But reptiles adapted quickly. Some evolved into small, agile forms that hunted insects in the shadows of sparse vegetation. Others grew large again, feeding on the new plants that covered river valleys. The first true dinosaurs appeared among them, bipedal, fast-moving and warm-blooded enough to survive in variable climates. Their rise was gradual but decisive. Within tens of millions of years, they became the dominant land animals on Earth. They filled every niche imaginable: herbivores, carnivores, scavengers, and everything in between. They walked on 2 legs or 4, swam in rivers, flew through the air, and thundered across plains. Their diversity was unmatched, their success unchallenged. But not all reptiles became dinosaurs. The crocodilian ancestors continued to evolve alongside them, perfecting their design as semi-aquatic predators. The first turtles appeared, their shells forming from modified ribs and vertebrae. The lizards diversified, giving rise to countless small species that would persist even after the age of giants ended. The reptiles were not a single dynasty, but a vast network of related empires, each ruling its own domain. The success of reptiles was tied closely to their physiology. Unlike amphibians, they did not need moist skin to breathe. Their lungs were efficient, their scales prevented water loss, and their eggs could survive in almost any environment. They could live in deserts, forests, mountains, and swamps. This flexibility allowed them to dominate nearly every ecosystem on land. The Mesozoic world was a place of abundance. Warm climates stretched from equator to pole, and vegetation grew thick across continents. Ferns, cycads, and conifers formed dense forests that provided shelter and food. Rivers teemed with fish, and insects buzzed in endless variety. In this world, the reptiles thrived. Herbivorous species grew to enormous sizes, their bulk defended by sheer mass or armoured hides. Carnivores evolved powerful jaws, sharp teeth, and claws built for pursuit. Every evolutionary path led to success. The dinosaurs, in particular, became the ultimate expression of reptilian dominance. They adapted to every environment and body plan possible. Some, like the sauropods, reached lengths of over 30 meters, feeding from treetops and reshaping forests with every step. Others, like the theropods, became swift predators, using speed and intelligence to hunt. Smaller dinosaurs evolved feathers, an adaptation that began as insulation and later became the key to flight. The variety was astonishing. Life had never diversified so extravagantly before. Even the skies were not beyond their reach. Pterosaurs, relatives of dinosaurs, were the first vertebrates to achieve powered flight. Their wings, formed from stretched membranes of skin supported by elongated fingers, allowed them to soar over oceans and cliffs, hunting fish and insects. They ruled the air for over 150 million years, long before birds refined the art of flight. Beneath the water's surface, reptiles took new forms as well. Some returned to the sea, evolving into powerful swimmers like ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs. They replaced the fish-like predators of earlier ages, dominating marine ecosystems with sleek hydrodynamic bodies. The Earth, for the first time, was ruled by one class of animal across land, sea, and air. It was truly the age of the reptilian dynasties. Their rule was not peaceful. It was a world of constant change, of arms races between predator and prey. Each adaptation triggered another. Speed countered size, armour answered teeth, and cunning matched strength. Yet, for over 160 million years, this balance held. The reptiles shaped the planet's landscapes, its food chains, and even its atmosphere. The carbon they locked into shells and bones would one day become limestone and fossil fuel, silent records of their dominion. Through it all, the Earth itself continued to shift. Pangaea split apart, forming new oceans and continents. Climates changed, species migrated, and evolution kept pace. The reptiles adapted to every upheaval, surviving droughts, floods, and ice. Their resilience seemed endless, but no dynasty lasts forever. The very forces that had made the reptiles masters of the earth would one day conspire to end their reign. The planet, in its quiet cycles of creation and destruction, was already preparing the next great transformation. The sky would darken, the air would cool, and the age of giants would falter. But before that final moment, the reptiles would experience their greatest flourishing, their most complete mastery of the world they had inherited. They had taken the lesson of the amphibians, freedom from water, and perfected it. They had filled every environment, conquered every element. Their eggs carried the sea inside them, their scales carried the sun. They were the ultimate expression of adaptation, the proof that life could thrive anywhere it chose. As the Triassic gave way to the Jurassic, and the Jurassic to the Cretaceous, the reptiles reached their zenith. Dinosaurs grazed in herds across vast plains, leaving footprints that would harden into stone. Flying reptiles soared above them, and crocodiles lurked in rivers waiting for prey. The earth was warm, its ecosystems stable and lush. It was a golden age of life's ambition, when the descendants of small, scaly survivors of the swamps had risen to become the undisputed rulers of the planet. And in the shadows of this greatness, small mammals scurried unnoticed, living quiet lives beneath the feet of giants. They were the heirs of the synapsids that had once challenged reptilian dominance, now reduced to hiding and waiting. The reptiles held the world in their claws, but history was patient. The reign of the reptiles was the longest and most diverse in the history of complex life. For hundreds of millions of years they defined what it meant to rule. They reshaped the planet's ecosystems, influenced its chemistry, and wrote the blueprint for survival across extreme environments. When their time finally ended, it would not be because they failed, but because the Earth itself shifted beneath them. But for now, they ruled completely. From deserts to deltas, from forests to mountain lakes, their presence was absolute. They were the children of the land and the masters of adaptation. Their breath filled the warm air, their shadows crossed every horizon, their footsteps thundered across the earth that had become their kingdom. And when the sun set over the Jurassic plains, the sound of life was everywhere. The low calls of herding dinosaurs, the splash of reptiles hunting in rivers, the flap of wings against a burning sky. The planet had never been more alive, never more balanced in its abundance. The dynasty of reptiles had reached its peak, and the world turned beneath their steady gaze. Soon, another chapter would begin, one written in the fire of impact and the silence that followed. But in this moment, under the golden light of the Mesozoic sun, the earth belonged entirely to them. The world that the dinosaurs inherited was warm, lush, and brimming with life. The air was thick with oxygen, the forests stretched endlessly across continents, and the climate was stable enough for ecosystems to thrive for millions of years at a time. The Earth had entered one of its longest periods of biological prosperity. The reptilian dynasties that had dominated the Triassic had splintered into countless forms, and among them, one lineage began to rise higher than the rest. These were the dinosaurs, and their story would become the longest and most magnificent reign of any animal empire the planet had ever seen. Their beginning was modest. The earliest dinosaurs were small, nimble creatures, no larger than dogs. They were descendants of archosaurs, the group that also included crocodiles and pterosaurs. In the Triassic world, they lived in the shadow of other reptiles that still held sway, giant amphibians, armoured herbivores, and predatory cousins that shared their body plans. But evolution had granted dinosaurs a few key advantages. Their legs were positioned directly beneath their bodies, giving them balance and endurance. Their metabolisms were faster, allowing greater activity in both day and night, and they were adaptable, able to survive as the world changed around them. The Triassic period ended in upheaval. Volcanic eruptions split the continents, releasing carbon dioxide and triggering a wave of extinctions. Many of the reptile groups that had ruled before vanished. The dinosaurs, by luck and resilience, survived and spread into the empty spaces left behind. With their competition gone, they expanded rapidly. By the time the Jurassic dawned, they were everywhere, on land, in the air, and even along the coasts. The planet had become their domain. The Jurassic Earth was a paradise for them. Warm temperatures reached into the polar regions, and the atmosphere was rich enough to support dense vegetation. Conifer forests towered across the continents, and ferns carpeted the ground. Rivers and lakes teemed with life, and the skies were filled with insects and small flying reptiles. Into this abundance came creatures of staggering size and beauty. The dinosaurs diversified into forms so varied that they seemed to defy imagination. Some became the gentle giants of the earth, the sauropods. They were colossal plant-eaters, their bodies stretching the length of city buses, their necks rising like cranes above the treetops. They moved in slow herds, stripping leaves from branches and leaving behind open clearings that shaped the landscape. Their size was their defense. Few predators dared attack an adult sauropod. Their massive hearts pumped blood through necks that could reach over 10 meters long, and their lungs worked like bellows, exchanging air efficiently enough to sustain their enormous bodies. Their footsteps carved paths into the soil that would one day fossilize into trails of stone. Alongside them lived smaller herbivores, stegosaurs with plates and spines, ornithopods with nimble legs and beaked mouths, and armoured ankylosaurs covered in bone-like shields. Each found its own way to feed, defend, and survive. The balance of herbivores and predators stabilized into an intricate system, each species shaping the others through the quiet mathematics of evolution. The carnivores of this age were just as remarkable. Some, like Allosaurus, grew to immense size, hunting in groups to bring down even the largest prey. Others relied on speed and agility, stalking smaller dinosaurs and early mammals. They were perfectly adapted to their roles, their senses sharp, their bodies light and efficient. The design of a large theropod, its long tail for balance, its powerful legs, its jaws filled with serrated teeth, was one of nature's masterpieces, honed by millions of years of trial and refinement. Life in the Jurassic was not merely a competition for survival. It was a story of coexistence. The ecosystems were vast, complex and interconnected. Herbivores shaped the vegetation through constant grazing, while predators controlled their populations. Scavengers and small omnivores recycled what was left, and insects and microorganisms broke everything down in turn. Every death fed life again. The cycle of the biosphere reached a level of balance it had never known before. The climate helped maintain this harmony. The world was largely warm and humid, with no polar ice and high sea levels. Shallow seas covered much of the land, creating coastal plains and archipelagos that provided endless habitats. Volcanic activity was frequent, but life adapted to it. Forests regrew quickly after eruptions, and rivers carved fertile valleys through new rock. The Earth was dynamic but stable enough to sustain the dinosaurs' immense size and diversity. Even the skies were changing. The pterosaurs, distant cousins of the dinosaurs, had already mastered flight. Some were small, flitting through forests like birds, while others had wingspans longer than a small airplane. They soared over coastlines, fishing from the waves, or glided inland to feed on carrion and small prey. The air, once silent, was now alive with motion. Though birds would not yet appear for millions of years, the foundations of flight were being tested and perfected. In the oceans, life was no less extraordinary. Reptiles like ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs ruled the waves, preying on fish and ammonites. Their sleek bodies were built for speed and power, their lungs efficient enough to sustain deep dives. The sea, like the land, had fallen under reptilian control. The entire planet was woven together by these lineages, Each one adapted to a different element of the same world. As the Jurassic gave way to the Cretaceous, the continents began to drift apart. New coastlines formed, climates changed, and isolated ecosystems developed unique species. This fragmentation encouraged even more diversity. Dinosaurs evolved new shapes, behaviours, and strategies. Herbivores grew horns and frills for defence and display, like the ceratopsians that would later dominate North America. Others developed complex social structures, forming herds that migrated across vast plains. Carnivores evolved new hunting methods, relying on cooperation or ambush rather than brute strength alone. The Cretaceous world was one of both beauty and tension. The plants themselves were evolving. Flowering plants, or angiosperms, appeared for the first time, changing the entire structure of ecosystems. Their blossoms attracted insects, leading to coevolution between pollinators and plants. Seeds replaced spores as a more efficient way to reproduce and spread. The air became richer with scent and colour. The green landscapes of the earlier eras began to take on the hues of flowers. The world had never looked more alive. In this setting, the dinosaurs continued to thrive. Some grew smaller, adapting to the new plant life and changing climates. Others became larger and more specialised. Tyrannosaurs rose to dominance as apex predators, their massive jaws capable of crushing bone. Triceratops and other horned dinosaurs filled the plains, while duck-billed hadrosaurs became the most numerous herbivores of all. The balance of predator and prey reached its final, most complex state. Even as the continents shifted and sea levels rose, the dinosaurs remained resilient. They had survived countless volcanic eruptions, climate fluctuations, and extinctions before. Their designs were too successful, too deeply woven into the structure of the biosphere to be easily undone. From the smallest feathered hunters in the undergrowth to the largest sauropods grazing in herds, they ruled every part of the world. But their dominance was not merely physical. The evolution of feathers, first for insulation and display, would eventually lead to something far more profound. Among small, fast-running theropods, feathers became more elaborate, their functions expanding. They allowed better temperature control, then gliding, then true flight. In the forests and cliffs of the late Jurassic and early Cretaceous, the first birds appeared, descendants of dinosaurs that had learned to master the sky. With their hollow bones, keeled sternums, and feathers, they were the future already taking shape in the present. To stand in the world of the dinosaurs would have been to witness a planet at its peak of life's productivity. Herds moved across valleys that stretched to the horizon, their footsteps vibrating through the ground. Predators stalked them with intelligence and strategy. The air was filled with the cries of creatures communicating over long distances. The world was never still, never silent, yet it was in balance. Every ecosystem was full, every niche occupied. Even at night the Earth remained alive. Under the light of a Cretaceous moon, smaller dinosaurs hunted by starlight. Insects sang among the ferns, and the air carried the warmth of the day. Volcanoes flared on the horizon, their glow reflected in distant lakes. This was a world that had reached a kind of perfection, stable, complex, self-sustaining. It had taken over 3 billion years for life to reach this point, and for 160 million years dinosaurs were its stewards. The scale of time is almost incomprehensible. If the entire history of the Earth were compressed into a single calendar year, dinosaurs would have appeared around mid-December and reigned until late December 26th. For the remaining few days of that year, mammals would still be small, birds would still be learning to fly, and the continents would still be drifting. It was their age entirely. But even the most enduring reigns end. Deep beneath the Earth, tectonic forces were building. Volcanic activity in regions that would become India was releasing massive amounts of gas into the atmosphere, slowly altering the climate. Sea levels rose and fell, disrupting habitats. Species began to shift and adapt. Yet these changes, though challenging, were not enough to end the dinosaurs. They had survived worse. The true end would come suddenly without warning from the sky. Before that final impact, though, they continued to flourish. The diversity of the late Cretaceous was greater than at any other time, from the polar regions to the equator, from mountaintops to mangrove swamps. Dinosaurs ruled with quiet dominance. Their world was a masterpiece of adaptation, the result of hundreds of millions of years of evolution. It's easy to think of their reign as something distant and alien, but in many ways it set the stage for everything that followed. The structure of ecosystems, the interaction between herbivores and carnivores, the development of complex social behaviour, all of it traces back to them. Even the very air we breathe carries their influence, for the plants that evolved alongside them shaped the oxygen balance of the world we inherited. When you look at a bird today, you're seeing not a descendant of dinosaurs, but a living dinosaur itself, carrying forward the legacy of that era. Their feathers, their hollow bones, their instincts, all are remnants of a lineage that never truly ended. The age of the dinosaurs did not vanish entirely, it transformed. Before the end, the Earth must have been breathtaking. Vast inland seas divided the continents. Forests of flowering plants stretched across the horizon, filled with insects and the calls of creatures that no human ear would ever hear. The nights were warm and bright with volcanic light. The balance of the planet seemed eternal, and then, in an instant measured in seconds, it was gone. A rock from space 10 kilometers across entered the atmosphere at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour. It struck the shallow waters of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, releasing more energy than every nuclear weapon that would ever exist. The shockwave flattened forests for hundreds of miles. Firestorms swept across continents. The sky filled with ash, blocking sunlight for months. Temperatures plummeted. Photosynthesis ceased. The great herds starved, and the predators that depended on them followed. The age of the dinosaurs ended not with a slow decline, but with sudden silence. Yet even in that silence, life endured. Some birds survived, sheltered in pockets of the world where food remained. Small mammals, too, found refuge underground or in burrows. The oceans recovered slowly, their chemistry stabilizing over millennia. From the ashes of the dinosaurs' empire, new forms of life began to rise. Their reign had lasted longer than any that came before or after. They had seen continents form and drift, climates change, and entire lineages rise and fall. For over 160 million years, they were the architects of ecosystems, the dominant life forms of the planet. Their disappearance was not a failure but a transformation, one chapter closing so that another could begin. Even now, the traces of their time are everywhere. Their bones rest in stone, their footprints cross deserts, and their genes live on in every bird that flies. The echo of their rule still shapes the Earth's rhythms, the migration of species, the balance of ecosystems, the persistence of life through catastrophe. The world after them would belong to smaller creatures, to those who had hidden and waited. The reptiles would continue in the form of lizards, turtles, and crocodiles, but the throne of dominance would pass to new rulers. The mammals, descendants of the humble synapsids that had once scurried in the shadows, were ready to emerge into the sunlight. And so the age of giants gave way to an age of endurance. The thunder of footsteps faded, replaced by the quiet rustle of leaves and the heartbeat of smaller, warmer bodies. The Earth turned once more, the sun rose on a world without dinosaurs, and the long story of life began again, reshaped but unbroken. When the great land dwellers had ruled the continents, the skies and oceans were no less alive. While the dinosaurs thundered across plains and forests, other rulers shared the earth in realms the giants could never reach. The sky and sea became their kingdoms, vast domains shaped by wind and current instead of soil and root. In these spaces, evolution had written different laws. Bones were light, limbs became wings and fins, and survival depended not on strength or armour, but on movement. The air and the water demanded grace, and so the lords of the sky and sea were born. their stories began long before the last dinosaurs appeared. Even in the early Mesozoic, when reptiles first began to flourish, some had already turned their eyes upward and others downward, leaving the land behind. The air was still a dangerous frontier, thin, unpredictable, and full of unseen forces. To conquer it required profound changes in anatomy and behaviour. But once flight was achieved, it offered rewards no other adaptation could match. The sky meant freedom, safety from predators, and the ability to travel vast distances in search of food. The first vertebrates to take that leap were the pterosaurs. They emerged more than 200 million years ago, long before birds existed, and they would dominate the air for almost as long as the dinosaurs ruled the ground. Their bodies were unlike anything before them. Hollow bones for lightness, muscles arranged in aerodynamic precision, and wings formed by a membrane of skin stretched along an elongated finger. The structure was both delicate and strong, a balance of tension and flexibility that allowed them to soar effortlessly on thermals and sea breezes. In the early stages of their evolution, pterosaurs were small, fragile-looking creatures. They lived along coastlines and river deltas, feeding on insects and small fish. But over millions of years, they diversified into an astonishing array of forms. Some developed long, toothy beaks for snatching prey from the water. Others evolved crests for display or stability in flight. A few reached unimaginable sizes. The largest, Quetzalcoatlus, had wings that spanned over 10 meters, longer than a small airplane. Standing on the ground, it would have been taller than a giraffe. Despite its scale, it was built for flight, its lightweight bones and powerful muscles allowing it to glide for kilometers without flapping. The air, once silent except for the sound of wind, now carried the rhythm of wings. The skies of the Jurassic and Cretaceous were full of movement. Pterosaurs circled above coastlines, their shadows flickering across the water. Some hunted fish in shallow seas, diving with precision, while others scavenged along beaches, walking on folded wings that served as forelimbs. Their variety was staggering, and their mastery of the air unparalleled for millions of years. But they were not the only lords of the sky. Among the dinosaurs themselves, new experiments in flight were beginning. Feathers, first evolved for insulation, became tools for gliding, display, and balance. Small, agile theropods began to leap from branch to branch, using their feathered limbs to slow their falls. Over time, these leaps became glides, and glides became powered flight. The transition was gradual but relentless. By the late Jurassic, true birds had appeared, blending the reptilian structure of their ancestors with the refinements of flight. One of the earliest and most famous was Archaeopteryx, a creature caught perfectly between two worlds. It had feathers and wings, but also teeth and a long bony tail. Its wings were primitive, its flight uncertain, but it could glide and flap short distances, escaping predators or hunting small prey. In its body, evolution's intention was clear. The air was the next great frontier. From these beginnings came the lineage that would one day outlast all others. Birds diversified quickly, experimenting with size, shape, and behaviour. Some adapted to forests, others to open plains or coastal cliffs. Their feathers grew more specialised, their bones lighter, their respiratory systems more efficient. The air became a living ecosystem of its own, layered with hunters, scavengers, and travellers. Meanwhile, in the oceans below, another transformation was unfolding. The same reptilian lineages that had conquered the land were returning to the sea, reshaping their bodies for a life without solid ground. The water, once the cradle of all life, was calling them back, and they answered with forms both familiar and alien. Among the first to make this return were the ichthyosaurs. Their ancestors had been land reptiles, but in the early Triassic they began to adapt to a fully aquatic life. Over millions of years their limbs became fins, their bodies streamlined, and their tails developed vertical flukes like those of modern fish. They evolved large eyes for hunting in dim light, and they gave birth to live young in the water, freeing themselves completely from the land. In their prime, They ruled the seas as apex predators, hunting squid and fish with incredible speed and precision. Their design was so perfect for swimming that it resembled that of dolphins, an example of how evolution finds the same solutions through different paths. Following them came the plesiosaurs and pliosaurs, relatives with vastly different shapes but equal dominance. The plesiosaurs had long necks and small heads, using their 4 powerful flippers to glide through the water like underwater birds. They hunted with grace rather than speed, weaving through schools of fish and catching prey with quick snaps of their jaws. The pliosaurs, in contrast, were the giants of their time, short-necked, broad-headed predators with jaws strong enough to crush bone. Some grew longer than 15 meters, their bites among the most powerful of any animal that ever lived. These marine reptiles transformed the oceans into vast hunting grounds. The surface waters teemed with ammonites, squid-like creatures encased in coiled shells, while deeper regions were filled with plankton and small fish. The reptiles hunted in every layer, from the shallows to the open sea. Some evolved specialized senses to detect vibrations, others could dive deep, holding their breath for long minutes as they searched for prey. The oceans had become a world of giants, silent and graceful beneath the waves. Above them, the skies remained busy. Pterosaurs glided over coastal waters, occasionally diving for fish that flashed near the surface. Birds, still young in their evolution, began to share the air, their feathers allowing finer control and sharper turns. For millions of years, these two lineages, pterosaurs and birds, coexisted. Each occupied its own niche, one relying on leathery wings and the other on feathers. The sky was big enough for both. The coexistence of these aerial and marine empires created one of the most complex global ecosystems in the history of life. The land provided plants, which fed herbivorous dinosaurs, whose remains fed scavengers and enriched the soil. Rivers carried nutrients to the sea, where plankton thrived, feeding fish and marine reptiles. The oceans evaporated, forming clouds that returned to the land as rain, closing the cycle. The balance of air, sea and land was nearly perfect, and every part of it was ruled by reptiles in one form or another. To live in that world would have been to witness motion on every scale. In the skies, the sweep of wings. In the oceans, the curve of bodies cutting through water. On the land, herds of dinosaurs moving across forests and plains. The Earth was a planet in motion, its energy flowing continuously from sun to plant to animal to sea and back again. The lords of the sea were not limited to size alone. Some marine reptiles were small, quick hunters adapted to shallow lagoons or coral reefs. Others grew to monstrous proportions, dominating open oceans. They evolved complex behaviors, some hunted in groups, others migrated with the seasons. Fossils show evidence of live birth, parental care, and even social interaction. These were not mindless predators, but intelligent, adaptable animals capable of navigating vast, changing environments. The lords of the sky, too, grew more complex over time. Later, pterosaurs developed intricate flight mechanics and elaborate head crests that may have served for communication or courtship. Birds evolved diverse beaks and wings, filling niches that range from insect hunting to scavenging. Some species became capable of long migrations, travelling thousands of kilometres each year. They were beginning to shape not only their ecosystems, but the flow of nutrients across continents. As the Cretaceous advanced, both aerial and marine reptiles reached their peak. The oceans were filled with mosasaurs, enormous marine lizards descended from land-dwelling ancestors. They were sleek, fast, and deadly, their double-hinged jaws allowing them to swallow large prey whole. They replaced the ichthyosaurs, which had vanished earlier, and became the dominant predators of the sea. No fish or reptile could match their power. In the air, pterosaurs grew to their greatest diversity. Some were small and insect-eating, others immense and ocean-faring. Yet they now shared the skies with birds that had become highly efficient flyers. The two groups competed silently for dominance. birds had an advantage. They could fold their wings, walk easily on land, and reproduce quickly. Pterosaurs, though still magnificent, were beginning to face limits in a changing world. Through it all, the climate remained kind. The Cretaceous was warm and humid, with high sea levels that flooded the continents. The oceans teemed with life, the coasts were rich with vegetation, and the skies were busy with wings. It was a world of abundance, each layer of the biosphere thriving in harmony with the others. And then, as always, the Earth shifted again. Volcanic eruptions darkened the skies, continents drifted farther apart, and temperatures began to fluctuate. The balance that had held for so long started to strain. The great extinction that would end the age of reptiles approached slowly, like a shadow lengthening across a bright field. When the asteroid struck, it ended not only the reign of the land-dwelling dinosaurs, but also the dominion of the lords of the sky and sea. The oceans turned toxic as plankton collapsed at the base of the food chain. The air filled with dust that blocked sunlight, grounding the pterosaurs and starving the birds. Marine reptiles, unable to find prey, perished within months. The ecosystems that had taken millions of years to build unravelled in a geological instant. Yet, as with every end, survival found a foothold. Some birds endured, perhaps scavenging along coastlines or surviving on seeds. From them, the diversity of modern avians would one day emerge. In the sea, smaller creatures, fish, sharks and turtles, reclaimed dominance. The ocean would eventually give rise to new giants, whales, which would evolve tens of millions of years later, taking the place once held by ichthyosaurs and mosasaurs. The reign of the lords of the sky and sea had lasted more than 150 million years. Their legacy was motion itself, the conquest of air and water, the transformation of limbs into wings and fins, the proof that life could adapt to any medium. Every bird that glides through the sky today, every dolphin that leaps from the ocean's surface, carries echoes of that age. The shapes of their bodies, the patterns of their motion, are ancient blueprints written long before mammals rose to power. If you stand on a coastline now and watch gulls soar over the waves, or dolphins cut through the surf, you're seeing the continuation of that ancient lineage. The same forces of air and water that once lifted pterosaurs and carried plesiosaurs still shape these creatures today. The sea and the sky remain what they have always been, vast, open kingdoms that never truly lose their rulers, only change their names. In the long rhythm of the earth, every age gives way to another. When the last of the pterosaurs fell and the oceans quieted, the planet did not end. It rested, rebalanced, and began again. From the ashes of that silence, small, warm-blooded survivors would take their first steps into the light, ready to build new empires in a world forever altered by those who had ruled the sky and sea before them. The world had been full of movement and sound. The forests were heavy with heat, the seas glittered with scales and fins, and the skies were stitched with wings. For millions of years, life had stretched across the planet in perfect balance. Every surface, from the ocean floor to the highest cliffs, was alive. It was a world that seemed unbreakable, a world that had learned how to sustain itself through cycles of fire, flood, and rebirth. But even the most stable rhythms can falter, and even the greatest rulers can fall. The end of the Mesozoic was not simply a change in climate or geography. It was the collapse of an entire order of life, the great falling of crowns. It began quietly. Long before the final catastrophe, the planet had already started to shift beneath the surface. The continents, which had once been joined together, were drifting farther apart. The vast supercontinent of Pangaea had long since fractured, giving rise to new oceans and isolated lands. This fragmentation changed wind patterns, ocean currents, and rainfall. Deserts formed where rain had once fallen, and humid jungles took root in unexpected places. The balance that had sustained the dinosaurs' world for so long began to strain. volcanoes in what is now India unleashed enormous floods of lava across the land, forming the Deccan Traps, layers of basalt that would one day cover hundreds of thousands of square kilometres. These eruptions released gases into the atmosphere, warming some regions while cooling others. Carbon dioxide levels fluctuated wildly, and sulfur compounds dimmed the sunlight. The climate grew unpredictable. Some years brought drought, others floods. Plants adapted but slowly. Animals struggled. Food chains began to wobble. In the oceans, the change was just as severe. Nutrients from volcanic ash spurred algal blooms that consumed oxygen and poisoned marine ecosystems. Coral reefs withered, plankton populations crashed, and the great marine reptiles, the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, began to decline. The balance between predator and prey weakened. The seas, once teeming with colour and life, became unstable, and yet, even amid this growing tension, the dinosaurs continued to thrive. They had survived previous extinctions, adapted to countless upheavals, and recovered stronger each time. Evolution had made them masters of endurance. As the Cretaceous period drew toward its end, they still ruled the continents. Massive herbivores grazed in herds across plains and valleys, predators stalked them through the forests, and the skies remained filled with birds and pterosaurs. Life carried on, unaware that its age of abundance was nearing its final dawn. Then, one day, the light changed. A fragment of rock, about 10 kilometers wide, travelling faster than sound could be measured, entered the Earth's atmosphere. It was ancient, older than the planet itself, a remnant of the solar system's violent beginnings. When it struck, it released more energy than billions of tons of TNT. The impact site was the shallow sea of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, and the force of that collision reshaped the planet's surface in an instant. Within seconds, the surrounding rock vaporized. A fireball rose higher than the clouds, and molten debris rained across continents. The shockwave travelled around the world, flattening forests, boiling oceans, and sending tsunamis hundreds of meters high racing across coastlines. The air itself caught fire. For hours, the sky burned. Those who survived the immediate destruction faced a world transformed. Dust and soot filled the atmosphere, blocking the sun for months, perhaps years. Photosynthesis stopped. Plants withered, and the animals that depended on them starved. Temperatures plummeted, plunging the planet into a long, dark winter. When the fires cleared, the Earth was cold, silent, and empty. This was the boundary between ages, the point where one world ended and another began. More than 3/4 of all species vanished. The great reptiles of the land, the lords of the air and the masters of the sea were gone. Even creatures far from the impact suffered as ecosystems collapsed. The chain of life had been broken in too many places to recover quickly. The world that emerged in the aftermath was unrecognizable. The forests were gone, replaced by barren landscapes of ash. The oceans were acidic and murky, stripped of plankton. The skies were grey, the air thick with dust and sulphur. Yet, in that silence, life still stirred. In the soil, seeds waited. Underground, burrowing animals had survived the fire and the cold. Small mammals, creatures that had spent millions of years hiding from predators, emerged into the empty world. Birds, the descendants of small feathered dinosaurs, found refuge in places where enough vegetation remained to feed them. Reptiles, amphibians and fish lingered in lakes and rivers. It was not the end of life, only the end of its greatest age. The falling of crowns was not a single moment, but a process that unfolded over thousands of years. The impact was only the beginning. The planet's system struggled to find equilibrium again. Rain washed acids from the sky, cooling the land but eroding soil. Volcanoes continued to erupt for centuries, releasing greenhouse gases that slowly warmed the planet once more. After the initial cold came a long heat, a global fever that reshaped climates and created new deserts. The survivors faced constant change. but with fewer competitors they began to spread. The mammals, once confined to the shadows, multiplied. Their small size and adaptable diets gave them an advantage in a world where resources were scarce. They fed on insects, roots and carrion, anything that could sustain them. Their warm blood allowed them to stay active in cold conditions, and their fur protected them from the temperature extremes that followed the impact. Over generations they grew larger, exploring the empty niches left behind by the vanished reptiles. Birds too began to diversify. Freed from the dominance of pterosaurs, they filled the skies with new forms. Some remained small and agile, while others evolved into ground dwellers or swimmers. The descendants of the few surviving lineages spread rapidly, their adaptability ensuring that flight would never again be lost from the Earth. The oceans recovered slowly. It took millions of years for plankton to return in sufficient numbers to restore the marine food web. Once they did, new kinds of fish, sharks, and marine mammals began to emerge. The great marine reptiles would never return, but their roles were eventually filled by whales, dolphins, and other descendants of land dwellers that ventured back to the sea. As life recovered, it reshaped the planet yet again. Forests regrew, first as ferns and shrubs, then as trees. The soil thickened, the rivers cleared, and new ecosystems began to form. The world had changed fundamentally, but the pattern was the same: destruction followed by renewal. The crowns had fallen, but the throne of life never stayed empty for long. The extinction that ended the age of dinosaurs was not the first time the Earth had seen such devastation. It was the fifth major extinction in the planet's history, and each one before it had cleared the stage for new rulers. The end of the Permian had made way for the reptiles. The end of the Cretaceous made way for the mammals. The pattern was one of loss and opportunity, of endings that were also beginnings. In the geological record, the moment of impact is marked by a thin layer of clay enriched with iridium, a metal rare on Earth, but common in asteroids. That layer is found across every continent, a universal boundary between two worlds. Below it lie the fossils of dinosaurs, ammonites, and ancient forests. Above it, the fossils are smaller, simpler, and sparse. The difference is so stark that it reads like punctuation in the story of life. The rock itself carries the memory of catastrophe. To imagine those first years after the impact is to picture a planet both alien and familiar. The air would have been filled with the scent of sulphur and decay. The light would have been dim and golden, filtered through haze. The oceans, warm from the greenhouse gases that followed the cold, would have steamed under the sun. Rain would have fallen in acid sheets, carving new patterns into the land. Yet in the cracks of rock and the hollows of fallen trees, life was returning. Mosses grew on ash, insects crawled through the soil, and small creatures dug burrows to raise their young. The resilience of life was absolute. The crowns that fell in that age did not vanish completely. Their lineage persisted in new forms. The reptiles that had once ruled the land lived on as crocodiles and turtles. The air still belonged to their descendants, the birds. The sea would one day belong again to descendants of land animals who learned to swim. The DNA of the old world flowed into the new, carried by survivors who adapted to fill the empty spaces. The fall of one kingdom became the foundation of another. Over time, the Earth grew quiet again, not in emptiness, but in balance. The atmosphere cleared, the sunlight returned, and green spread once more across the continents. The great herds were gone, but smaller ones began to form. The predators that hunted them were no longer scale giants, but furred, warm-bodied hunters that moved silently through undergrowth. The age of reptiles had given way to the age of mammals, though no one was there to mark the change. And yet, in every corner of the Earth, the marks of the fallen still lingered. The fossils of dinosaurs lay buried beneath layers of sediment, their bones preserved in stone. The patterns of their ecosystems lived on in new forms. The forests that grew in their absence were shaped by the same cycles of growth and decay that they had once sustained. The memory of their world was written into the DNA of every living thing that followed. The great falling of crowns was not a tragedy in the cosmic sense. It was part of a deeper rhythm, the heartbeat of the planet itself. Life expands, fills every niche, and then, through some vast disturbance, contracts. What remains adapts, evolves, and begins again. Each fall gives rise to something new. The Earth has always built its future on the ruins of its past. If you were to walk across the landscapes of that recovery, millions of years after the impact, you would see forests growing over ancient craters, rivers flowing through valleys carved by fire, and animals that bore faint echoes of the ones that came before. The sky would be filled again with wings, those smaller, lighter ones. The ground would move again with herds, though furred and quick instead of scaled and massive. The seas would shimmer once more with life, though quieter, as if the planet itself remembered the cost of abundance. The fall of one age had made space for another. The crowns that once gleamed in the sunlight of the Mesozoic now lay buried in stone, but the kingdom of life continued. The same sun that had warmed the dinosaurs still rose each morning. The same oceans that had carried ichthyosaurs still moved with the tides. The same earth that had endured 5 extinctions still turned, ready to begin again. And in that new dawn, among the roots of the regrown forests and the whispers of the cooling wind, the next rulers were already emerging, small, clever, and full of potential. Their time had come quietly, just as all great eras do, not with thunder, but with the soft, steady rhythm of survival. The fallen had left behind an empty stage, and the next act of the story was ready to begin. The silence that followed the end of the great reptiles did not last long. The ashes of the fallen world were still warm when new sounds began to stir. Faint rustles in the undergrowth, small footsteps on soft soil, the whisper of creatures that had lived unseen through the long ages of the giants. They were the survivors, those who had endured the darkness by staying small, by hiding, by adapting. And now, with the sky clear again and the forests returning, it was their turn to inherit the Earth. The age that followed the fall of the dinosaurs was unlike any before it. The air grew cooler and clearer, the climate steadier, and the continents drifted into new arrangements that shaped the future of oceans and winds. Forests spread across valleys, grasslands began to emerge where trees could not take hold, and rivers carved new paths through young mountains. The world had been emptied and reborn. In this quieter, gentler environment, the small creatures that had once scurried in the shadows began to explore the open ground. They were the mammals, and they were about to rise. For more than 100 million years, mammals had lived in the margins. During the reign of the dinosaurs, they had been mostly nocturnal, small, and secretive. Their bones were delicate, their lives brief, and their world limited to burrows, branches, and the spaces between predators' steps. But those limitations had been their strength. They had learned to survive by being adaptable, warm-blooded, and quick to reproduce. When the catastrophe came, it was not the largest or the strongest who endured, but the most flexible. The earliest mammals after the extinction were not yet the forms we recognize today. They were small insect eaters, shrew-like creatures with keen senses of smell and hearing. They fed on insects, roots, and seeds, living in burrows and under fallen logs. Their size allowed them to survive on a little food, and their warm-blooded bodies kept them active in the cold world that followed the impact. Over time, they diversified into dozens of shapes and strategies. Some took to the trees, others remained on the ground, and a few ventured into the water. The age of smallness had ended. The first great expansion came during the Paleocene, around 60 million years ago. The planet was still recovering from the extinction, but life was flourishing again. Tropical forests stretched from pole to pole. The air was humid and temperatures were high. Mammals took advantage of this abundance, evolving rapidly to fill the empty niches left behind by the dinosaurs. Without competition from the giant reptiles, they began to grow larger, bolder, and more specialized. Some became plant eaters, developing flat teeth for grinding leaves and seeds. Others became hunters, their jaws strong and their senses sharp. The first true carnivores emerged, swift predators that hunted other mammals in dense forests. Their descendants would one day become cats, dogs, and bears. The first large herbivores appeared as well, ancestors of horses, cows, and elephants. The balance between predator and prey was re-established, but on a smaller, more agile scale. In this new world, evolution seemed to accelerate. Mammals experimented with every possible lifestyle. Some glided through forests with skin membranes stretched between their limbs. Others dug tunnels underground, living in complete darkness. A few even returned to the sea, taking the first steps toward the forms that would become whales and dolphins. Each generation pushed the boundaries of what was possible, exploring every niche that the dinosaurs had left behind. Their success was tied to their biology. Unlike reptiles, mammals could regulate their own body temperature. They could stay active in cold weather, hunt at night, and live in environments that would have been impossible for their ancestors. Their young were born alive and nurtured with milk, giving them a greater chance of survival. They formed social groups, developed complex behaviours, and began to communicate in ways far beyond the instincts of earlier creatures. The spark of intelligence that had flickered in the darkness for millions of years began to glow more brightly. The world itself was changing along with them. The early Paleogene was a time of warmth, but gradually the climate began to cool. The continents continued to drift, closing old seas and opening new ones. The collision of India with Asia lifted the Himalayas, reshaping global weather patterns. Ocean currents shifted, carrying warm water toward the poles and cooling the equator. Rainfall patterns changed, and the dense tropical forest began to thin in places. Grassland started to spread, offering new challenges and opportunities. Mammals adapted again. Those that had lived in trees learned to run across open plains. Herbivores developed longer legs and stronger teeth to handle the tough grasses. Predators evolved to chase them, becoming faster and more coordinated. The rhythm of life changed from the quiet stillness of forests to the motion of the open world. Herds formed and migrated across great distances. The pulse of the planet became one of movement and endurance. As the Eocene epoch unfolded around 50 million years ago, mammals reached new heights of diversity. The forests of this time were lush and filled with life. Early primates swung through branches, testing the dexterity that would one day define humanity. Large herbivores like brontotheras and tapirs roamed the lowlands. Tiny hoofed mammals grazed in clearings, and the first true whales swam in shallow seas. The oceans, once ruled by reptiles, now belonged to their mammalian descendants. The ancestors of whales had started as land animals, likely related to small hoofed creatures that lived near rivers. Over generations, they became more aquatic. Their limbs transformed into flippers, their nostrils moved to the tops of their heads, and their bodies streamlined for swimming. Within a few million years, they were fully marine. They gave birth in the water, hunted fish and squid, and communicated with sound. The mammals had returned to the ocean, and this time they would stay. On land, the story was just as dynamic. The first large carnivores, the creodonts, hunted across continents, their teeth adapted for slicing flesh. They would later give way to the ancestors of modern cats and dogs, whose balance of speed and precision made them more efficient. Herbivores diversified into browsers, grazers, and mixed feeders, their digestive systems evolving to handle different plants. Life was not static. It was an endless series of experiments. By the Oligocene epoch, about 30 million years ago, the world looked increasingly familiar. The cooling climate gave rise to more open landscapes. Grasslands spread further, replacing many of the old tropical forests. This shift favoured animals that could run, the swift herbivores and the predators that pursued them. The first true horses appeared, small and three-toed, grazing on the tough new grasses. Elephants evolved from smaller, more primitive ancestors, developing trunks and tusks for feeding and defence. Camels, deer and rhinoceroses appeared in various regions, their shapes and behaviours reflecting the environments they inhabited. The rise of grasslands transformed not only the land but the atmosphere itself. Grasses used a different form of photosynthesis that altered the global carbon cycle. Their roots stabilised soil and reduced erosion, helping to regulate the planet's climate. Fire became a regular part of ecosystems, clearing old growth and stimulating renewal. Mammals adapted to this fire-driven world, evolving behaviours to escape and recover quickly. The Earth had entered a new phase of balance, driven by mammals and the plants they depended on. Social behaviour also became more complex. Many mammals began to live in groups, cooperating to hunt, raise young or defend territory. Communication evolved from simple sounds to elaborate calls and signals. Intelligence increased, driven by the challenges of survival and cooperation. The brains of some species grew larger, capable of planning, memory, and even problem-solving. The foundations of emotion, empathy, and awareness were taking shape in the minds of creatures that had once been prey. As the Miocene epoch dawned, around 23 million years ago, the world grew cooler still. Ice began to form at the poles, and sea levels dropped. Forest retreated, grasslands expanded, and deserts spread in dry regions. The New World favoured endurance and adaptability. Mammals grew stronger, faster, and more specialised. Elephants evolved into massive forms like mastodons and gomphotheres, spreading across continents. Horses multiplied in variety, from small forest dwellers to large plains runners. Carnivores diversified into wolves, big cats and bears, refining the art of predation. In Africa and parts of Asia, primates continued to evolve quietly. Their hands grew more dexterous, their eyes more forward-facing, their movements more deliberate. Some descended from the trees and began to walk on two legs, freeing their hands for other tasks. They lived in small groups, used simple tools, and began to shape their environment in subtle ways. Though their story was still in its earlier stages, it was already clear that they carried something different, a level of awareness that hinted at what was to come. The mammals had become the architects of the planet's surface. Their migrations shaped vegetation, their grazing maintained open plains, and their waste fertilized the soil. They carried seeds in their fur and stomachs, spreading plants across continents. The climate itself was influenced by their activities, as forests grew and receded under their influence. For the first time since the age of the dinosaurs, the Earth's biosphere was once again tightly interconnected, sustained by a balance between animals and plants. The rise of mammals was not without its losses. Entire lineages vanished as climates changed and new species outcompeted the old. The great brontotheras disappeared, as did many early primates and marine forms. The world was in constant motion, a never-ending sequence of births and extinctions. But through it all, the mammals endured, diversifying into more forms than any group before them. By the time the Pliocene arrived, around 5 million years ago, the outlines of the modern world were visible. Continents had nearly reached their present positions. The land bridges that connected them allowed migrations that mixed species from different regions. In North America, camels and horses spread south. In Africa, elephants and antelopes multiplied. In Eurasia, cats and wolves expanded their ranges. The global web of life had become fully integrated, with mammals as its dominant players. They ruled the land not through sheer size but through versatility. They could inhabit deserts, forests, mountains and tundras. They could survive droughts, ice ages and volcanic winters. They were the most adaptable creatures the Earth had ever produced. Their intelligence, mobility and capacity for cooperation gave them resilience that no previous rulers had possessed. And among them, one lineage was changing faster than all the rest. The primates, with their hands, eyes and minds, were learning to think in new ways. They were tool users, problem solvers and communicators. They lived in families and shared knowledge between generations. The world was entering an age not only of mammals, but of minds. The age of mammals rising was not a sudden takeover, but a slow unfolding. Over tens of millions of years, they reshaped the planet through quiet persistence. They were not conquerors in the way the reptiles had been. They were caretakers, participants in a dynamic equilibrium that supported all life. Their dominance was based not on force, but on connection. The world they built would endure ice ages, extinctions, and the eventual arrival of a creature that could reflect on its own origins. But for now, it was a world of balance. Herds crossing open plains, forests alive with calls and movement, oceans filled with song. The mammals had risen, and the earth breathed with them. In the warmth of the Miocene sun, in the cold winds of the Pleistocene to come, they would continue to adapt, to think, to build the foundation for everything that would follow. And as the planet turned, carrying its new rulers through ages of change, the rhythm of life remained steady. A heartbeat echoing through time, rising, falling, and rising again, and rising. Long after the great mammals had taken their place as rulers of the land, after the thunder of dinosaurs had faded and the forests had regrown, the world remained full of other empires, quiet, unseen, and ancient. These were the hidden kingdoms, the ones that had never lost their hold on the earth. They existed beneath the roots, within the air, and across the surfaces of every living thing. They did not roar or walk or fly, yet their power was absolute. While the rise and fall of visible creatures shaped the headlines of life's story, these unseen rulers shaped the paragraphs between. They were the architects of continuity, the ones who had ruled before every age, and who still ruled now, unchanged by the dramas of extinction or evolution. From the very beginning, when the world was little more than stone and water, these small forms had already staked their claim. Microbes, fungi, and insects, the oldest, the smallest, and the most numerous, had never relinquished their dominion. The mammals might have risen, the reptiles might have fallen, but beneath every forest, under every ocean wave, and within every breath of air, the hidden kingdoms were still at work. In the soil, bacteria and fungi formed vast networks that connected life together. The forests that stretched across continents were held up not just by trunks and roots, but by invisible partnerships beneath the ground. Fungal threads known as mycelia wound through the earth, linking tree to tree, plant to plant. Through them passed signals, nutrients, and warnings, an underground conversation older than language itself. When one tree absorbed sunlight, another might share its carbon. When drought came, the network redirected water to the roots that needed it most. The fungi took their payment in sugars, completing a cycle that sustained both partners. It was a collaboration so intricate that no species could survive alone. This silent exchange was happening everywhere, every moment, and had been since long before the mammals appeared. Fungi had colonized the land even before plants had taken root, breaking down rock into soil, preparing the way for all that followed. They were the chemists of the planet, the original recyclers. Every fallen leaf, every dead creature, every trace of waste, all of it passed through their care. They broke matter back into its simplest elements, returning it to the air and earth. Without them, decay would stop, nutrients would lock away in lifeless forms, and the balance of life would collapse within a few short centuries. The great animals might have ruled the surface, but the fungi ruled time. Above them, in the air and among the plants, another quiet empire moved. The insects. They had survived every extinction, every climate change, every reshaping of the continents. While other creatures came and went, insects endured. Their designs were so efficient that they required little improvement. A beetle today is not so different from one that crawled under ferns 100 million years ago. Their bodies are perfect machines, light, durable, and endlessly adaptable. They have conquered air, soil, and water. They outnumber all vertebrates combined by an unimaginable scale. Each handful of soil holds billions of microbes and thousands of insect larvae. Each forest canopy hums with the activity of ants, bees, and flies, performing tasks so essential that most larger species would vanish without them. Pollination, decomposition, aeration of soil, the control of pest populations. All of these are governed by these ancient workers. The bees especially stand among the most important. Their relationship with flowering plants, born in the Cretaceous, has shaped nearly every ecosystem since. Every fruit, every seed that nourishes mammals, including humans, exists because of the tireless labour of these winged builders. They are a bridge between the world of plants and the world of animals, tiny creatures linking entire systems with their motion. And yet, the most dominant kingdom of all is the one we can hardly see. Microbes, bacteria, archaea, and viruses form the foundation of every living process. They inhabit every environment, from the deepest ocean trench to the thin air of mountain tops. They thrive in boiling springs, in ice, in acid, in the human body. They are older than any multicellular creature and more numerous than all other life combined. In every milliliter of seawater, there are millions. In every breath we take, thousands drift unseen. Microbes built the atmosphere we breathe and continue to maintain it. They fix nitrogen in the soil, making it available to plants. They break down toxins, digest waste, and regulate the carbon cycle. They form symbiotic relationships with nearly every animal, including us, living within our intestines, our skin, and even our cells. Our lives depend on them completely. The mitochondria that power our cells were once free-living bacteria, absorbed by ancient ancestors and repurposed. Every heartbeat, every thought, every breath is driven by that ancient union. Even as mammals rose to rule the land, these kingdoms never ceded control. They were the invisible infrastructure of life. The mammals could adapt to climate shifts and evolve intelligence, but they could not exist without the microscopic systems that sustained them. Every blade of grass, every drop of rain, every gust of air was part of the microbial network that kept the planet alive. When ice ages came and glaciers advanced, it was not the large creatures who first returned after the melt, but the small ones. Spores carried by wind, bacteria reviving from dormancy, insects migrating into thawing soil. They rebuilt the ecosystems piece by piece, unseen but unstoppable. The resilience of the earth has always been their work. Fungi, too, were among the quiet engineers of rebirth. After volcanic eruptions or meteor impacts, when the ground was coated in ash and the air heavy with sulfur, their spores were among the first to return. They could feed on minerals alone, forming the base for the return of plants. Their chemistry is ancient and relentless, capable of digesting nearly anything: rock, wood, bone, even radiation. In the ruins of every extinction, the fungal filaments spread first, transforming death into the ingredients of new life. The insects followed close behind. Ants built colonies in the cracks of cooling lava. Beetles burrowed into decaying plants. Termites began their endless cycle of building and rebuilding. The balance of life was restored from below, not from above. The great mammals and birds may have reshaped the visible earth, but these smaller rulers held its structure together. Even the atmosphere itself depends on them. Microbial communities in the ocean surface regulate the production of oxygen and the absorption of carbon dioxide. The tiny photosynthetic plankton drifting in sunlight produce roughly half of the planet's oxygen. They are eaten by zooplankton, which feed fish, which in turn sustain larger animals, a chain that begins with organisms too small to see. When plankton die, their bodies sink, carrying carbon into the deep ocean. This slow rain of organic matter keeps the climate stable and has done so for billions of years. In the Arctic, bacteria under ice convert methane to carbon dioxide, slowing the release of greenhouse gases. In the tropics, soil microbes release and absorb gases in balance, moderating the planet's temperature. Everywhere on Earth, invisible systems are at work maintaining the conditions for life. The mammals, clever as they are, live entirely within this web, rarely noticing it. The hidden kingdoms rule quietly, but completely. Their history stretches back farther than we can comprehend. Long before animals evolved, bacteria had already discovered nearly every biochemical pathway life would ever use. Photosynthesis, respiration, fermentation, all of these were their inventions. They had already mastered the exchange of energy between light and matter, long before plants or animals appeared. Fungi, too, had evolved intricate methods of growth, reproduction, and communication in complete darkness. The insects that came later carried this tradition of cooperation into visible life, forming colonies and hives that mirrored the behaviour of cells in a larger organism. The hidden kingdoms are not only ancient, they are also patient. Their evolution moves on timescales that make human history seem brief. A fungal network can live for thousands of years. A bacterial lineage can remain unchanged for billions. They exist beyond our concept of generational death. For them, life is not an individual story but a continuous process, one cell dividing into another endlessly. Every species that has ever lived owes its survival to these invisible empires. When mammals evolved complex stomachs to digest plants, it was microbes that made it possible. Without the bacteria in their guts, herbivores could not extract nutrients from cellulose. Without fungi breaking down leaf litter, those plants would never have grown. Even predators depend on them indirectly, their prey nourished by systems built on microbial foundations. Life, at every scale, is a partnership with the unseen. In the human body, this relationship is especially profound. For every human cell, there are roughly as many microbial cells living in or on us. They help digest food, produce vitamins, regulate immunity, and even influence mood and behaviour. The boundary between us and them is more porous than it seems. We are ecosystems, colonies of cells cooperating with countless smaller species. Our health and survival depend on their balance. We are, in a literal sense, built by the hidden kingdoms. It's easy to overlook them because they do not fit our image of life. We think of animals as rulers because they are large, visible, and mobile. But scale is not power. The microbes will outlast every visible species as they have always done. They do not need sunlight or air. They can sleep through ages of ice, awaken in warmth, and rebuild the world without memory or fatigue. Their resilience is unmatched. When we speak of the rise of mammals or the fall of dinosaurs or the shaping of continents, we're describing surface events. The deeper story, the one that never pauses, belongs to these small forms. They are the constant background to all of evolution's drama. They have witnessed every extinction, rebuilt every ecosystem, and carried the spark of life through every darkness. The world belongs to them, and it always has. Even now, in the Anthropocene, when humans dominate landscapes and alter climates, the hidden kingdoms remain. Bacteria thrive in cities, in water systems, in our homes, and in the atmosphere. Fungi digest waste and break down toxins in soil. Insects continue their patient labour, pollinating the plants that feed both animals and humans. Though our machines and structures seem vast, they are temporary compared to these ancient networks. Long after our species fades, these invisible rulers will continue their work restoring balance in silence. They are reminders that life's strength lies not in size or dominance, but in persistence. The kingdoms that survive are those that can adapt, cooperate, and endure. The microbes, fungi, and insects do not fight for power. They sustain it. Their rule is invisible but complete, woven into every breath of wind and grain of soil. When a leaf falls in a forest, it is not the end of that leaf. It becomes food for fungi, home for insects, and fuel for bacteria. It dissolves into the earth and returns to the air, reborn as part of another living thing. That cycle is their empire, quiet, eternal, and absolute. And as mammals walk above them, Unaware of the life beneath their feet, these hidden kingdoms continue their endless work. They do not seek recognition or victory. They are the Earth's memory, its pulse, its unseen mind. The story of life has always belonged to them, and while other crowns have fallen, theirs has never left the throne. Even now, as the world changes again, as climates shift and new species emerge, their influence remains everywhere. Every flower that opens, every forest that grows, every breath drawn by any creature, all of it is guided by the same ancient networks that first formed when the planet was young. The hidden kingdoms are still here, their rule unbroken, their presence constant beneath the ever-changing surface of the living Earth. And above them, in the warmth of the sunlight they helped create, the thinking creatures have begun to rise. Mammals that learned to use fire, to speak and to wonder. They would soon become something new, something capable of reflecting on all the kingdoms before them. The Earth was ready for its next ruler, though it would never truly stop belonging to those who had never ceased to rule it in silence. For billions of years, life had reshaped the Earth without reflection. The oceans breathed, forests grew, continents drifted, and creatures adapted to every rhythm of wind and light. The planet's story had been one of survival and change, written in patterns of instinct and evolution. No creature had ever asked why the sun rose, or wondered what it meant to exist, until one did. Somewhere in the long arc of the mammal's rise, a new kind of being began to appear, a thinking animal. It did not happen all at once. The shift was slow, invisible at first, buried in the small changes of behaviour that set one lineage apart from others. In Africa's forests and savannas, among the branches and open plains, primates evolved hands that could grasp, eyes that faced forward, and minds that could anticipate. They lived in groups, cared for their young and remembered things. They began to recognise patterns in the world, the cycle of fruit, the movement of prey, the approach of rain. They did not merely react to their surroundings, they learned from them. The early ancestors of humans were not unique in having intelligence, but they used it differently. Many animals could solve problems or communicate, but these primates began to link ideas together. They developed curiosity, imagination, and the ability to plan beyond the present moment. They learned to shape the environment to fit their needs rather than adapt passively to it. It was a small change in behaviour, but one with immense consequences. They walked upright, freeing their hands for other purposes. They used stones and sticks to dig, to hunt, to defend. Each generation inherited not just genes, but skills passed down through observation. Culture, the transmission of a learned behaviour, became a force as powerful as natural selection. It allowed knowledge to accumulate, making each generation more capable than the last. Evolution had produced a creature that could improve itself not just through biology, but through memory. As the African climate changed, forests gave way to grasslands. These early humans adapted to open environments, learning to travel long distances and cooperate in groups. Communication grew more complex. Sounds became symbols, gestures became shared meanings. Language, in its earliest form, allowed the exchange of ideas. With language came storytelling, teaching, and imagination. Tools that extended the reach of thought far beyond instinct. Fire was another turning point. At first, it was a force of fear, wild and uncontrollable, consuming forests after lightning strikes, but once mastered, it became the foundation of everything that followed. Fire provided warmth, protection, and light after sunset. It made food safer and easier to digest, freeing energy for brain growth. It extended the hours of activity, creating the first shared evenings, times of rest, communication, and reflection. Around the fire, the thinking animal began to see itself as separate from the world around it. It began to wonder. Generations passed, and the descendants of these early humans spread across continents. They followed rivers and coastlines, carrying their knowledge and adapting to new climates. They hunted, gathered, and built shelters. They made tools from stone, bone, and wood. With each new environment, they invented new ways of surviving. The cold of the north demanded clothing and fire. The dryness of deserts required storage and cooperation. The challenges of mountains and jungles sharpened their ingenuity. Everywhere they went, they left traces. Handprints on cave walls, carvings in bone, ash from campfires long extinguished. Those handprints are more than marks of presence. They are the earliest signs of awareness, evidence that these creatures knew they existed and wanted to be remembered. They were not only living, but observing life itself. They painted animals on stone, hunted by day and remembered by night. They buried their dead with tools and flowers, implying belief in something beyond the visible. They had crossed the threshold between existence and understanding. The earth changed around them, as it always had, but now one species was changing it deliberately. They shaped stone into blades, fibres into rope, and clay into vessels. They domesticated animals, turned wild plants into crops, and settled in one place to farm. Villages grew into towns, towns into cities. The thinking animal had found stability, a new kind of ecosystem built not by nature but by thought. Civilization began as a collaboration between imagination and necessity. Communities built walls to protect food stores, irrigation systems to channel rivers, and calendars to predict the seasons. Language evolved into writing, allowing thoughts to be recorded, remembered, and shared across generations. Knowledge was no longer fragile. It could survive the death of the individual. The story of humanity became cumulative, accelerating with each discovery. With surplus food came time to think, to create, to question. Art, music, and philosophy emerged. Humans began to look at the stars and ask questions no other creature had ever asked. What are we? Why are we here? They built myths to explain the movements of the heavens, temples to honour unseen powers, and societies to organise themselves under shared beliefs. Ideas became as real as stone and wood, shaping behaviour, conflict, and cooperation. The world of thought expanded faster than the body could evolve. Within only a few thousand years, an instant compared to the history of life, humans transformed the surface of the planet. Forests were cleared for farmland, rivers redirected, mountains mined, and metals forged. The first empires rose and fell, each one an experiment in how minds could organise themselves. With every generation, knowledge increased, and with it the power to alter the environment. The thinking animal learned to measure time, to map the earth, to record the movements of the sun and stars. It discovered mathematics, philosophy, and science, tools for decoding the patterns that had always governed nature. In doing so, it became the first species capable of understanding its own origins, of tracing itself back through the layers of history to the beginning of life itself. Yet this knowledge carried both wonder and burden. To understand the world was to see its fragility. The same intelligence that allowed humans to thrive also allowed them to harm. The mastery of fire became industry. The shaping of stone became architecture. The hunting of prey became war. With every gain came consequence. Forests fell faster than they could regrow, rivers filled with silt, and animals that had ruled for millennia disappeared under human expansion. The earth, which had always balanced itself through natural cycles, began to shift under the weight of thought. But the rule of the thinking animal was never absolute. It was intertwined with the hidden kingdoms that came before. The soil that fed crops still depended on microbes and fungi. The air still required the balance of oxygen and carbon maintained by plants and plankton. The insects still pollinated the flowers that became food. For all its intelligence, humanity remained part of the same web that had sustained every species before it. As societies grew, humans began to study themselves as well as the world. They built systems of ethics, religion, and philosophy to explain their place in the order of things. Some saw themselves as stewards of creation, others as conquerors. Some found harmony in nature, Others sought to escape it. The diversity of human thought reflected the complexity of their minds, capable of empathy and destruction, creativity and fear, logic and faith. They built languages not only to survive but to dream. They imagined futures, remembered pasts, and created worlds that existed only in their minds. No other animal could do this. The ability to simulate possibilities gave them control over their fate. They learned to cooperate on vast scales, to build societies that spanned continents, to create technologies that extended their reach. The Earth was no longer simply a home, it was a project, something to be shaped and understood. The mammals that had once watched the skies for predators now watched the stars for meaning. The same eyes that had once scanned the savannah for danger now gazed through telescopes at distant galaxies. The same hands that had once shaped stone tools now built machines that split atoms and travelled to other worlds. Intelligence had transformed from a survival tool into a creative force capable of rewriting nature itself. Yet beneath all of this progress lay the same biology, the same chemistry, the same ancient systems that had begun with microbes billions of years earlier. The human brain, for all its complexity, was built from the same proteins and elements as the first cells. The blood that flowed through veins carried iron forged in the cores of ancient stars. The body that built cities was the universe made conscious of itself. For all its ingenuity, the thinking animal was not outside of nature. It was nature made aware. The forests it cut down had given it oxygen. The oceans it explored had given it life. Every act of creation and destruction was part of the same continuous process. Humanity was not an exception to the Earth story. It was its latest expression. Still, awareness came with anxiety. To understand the passage of time was to recognize mortality. To know the universe was vast was to feel small. The first humans who looked at the stars must have felt both awe and fear, realizing they were thinking beings on a fragile world in a boundless cosmos. This awareness became the defining trait of their reign, the constant tension between wonder and responsibility. They sought to control nature, but they also longed to belong to it. They built cities of stone and metal, but filled them with symbols of forests, rivers, and light. They tried to master death through religion, memory, and science, yet every generation returned to the same truth. They were temporary, and the Earth would continue without them. Their intelligence made them powerful, but also restless. Over time, the pace of change quickened. Agriculture became industry, villages became nations, and tools became machines. The thinking animal learned to harness electricity, to split atoms, to send signals through invisible air. It mapped its own DNA, recreated the molecules of life, and began to alter the planet's atmosphere. The power of thought had reached a new level, one that could shape the destiny not only of humans, but of every species around them. And yet, even with all this control, the hidden kingdoms still ruled quietly beneath their feet. The soil still pulsed with microbial life. The air still depended on unseen chemistry. The oceans still breathed through the movement of plankton. Humanity's dominance was vast but delicate, resting on systems it could not fully replace. The thinking animal had become a maker of worlds, but it remained a guest within the larger living system of the Earth. The most remarkable thing about this age was not technology itself, but reflection, the ability of one species to look backward and see its own evolution, to trace the line from the first cell to the present moment. In doing so, humanity discovered humility. It learned that the same processes that shaped the dinosaurs, the same physics that formed the stars, were still at work. Thought itself was an extension of those forces, the universe learning to think through the medium of life. Each discovery added to this awareness. Microscopes revealed the hidden kingdoms that sustained existence. Telescopes revealed galaxies beyond counting. The line between the vast and the minute blurred, and humanity stood in the middle, aware of both. For the first time in history, the Earth had a species that could contemplate its own origins and imagine its own future. But imagination is a double-edged gift. It allowed humanity to create art and science, but also to build weapons capable of ending its own age. It gave rise to empathy, but also to fear. The thinking animal had inherited both the creativity of nature and its indifference. Whether this intelligence would sustain the planet or destroy it remained uncertain. Still, the same adaptability that had carried life through every previous extinction now resided in humanity's hands. The knowledge of cycles, balance, and connection was no longer hidden in the soil. It was understood, studied, and spoken aloud. The possibility of self-awareness was not only to see the Earth, but to care for it. The thinking animal, at its best, could become not a conqueror, but a guardian. And so the story continued. The planet still turning, the forest still breathing, the ocean still moving beneath the pull of the moon. The mammals had risen, and among them one had learned to ask questions of existence itself. The rule of the thinking animal had begun not with domination but with awareness, the slow unfolding of consciousness across the face of an ancient planet. The Earth had always had rulers, from microbes to dinosaurs to mammals. But this one was different. This one could look back across the ages and see all the others. It could remember the fallen crowns, the silent empires, the hidden kingdoms still at work. It could imagine what might come after it. And as the night deepened and the stars burned quietly overhead, the thinking animal began to realize that its reign was only another moment in the long, unbroken rhythm of life. The thinking animal had learned to measure time, to look backward into the fossil record and forward into imagined futures. It had learned to read the layers of the Earth like pages in a book, tracing its own emergence through stone and dust. It had built machines to study the sky, to split atoms, to explore the deep sea and even the barren surfaces of other worlds. It had shaped rivers, carved mountains, and changed the chemistry of the atmosphere. In doing so, it had become the first creature in the planet's history to alter the global systems that gave it life. But even as its power grew, the same truth that had guided every age remained. No rule lasts forever. When the story of humanity reaches its final page, the Earth will continue to turn. After us, the Earth endures. The planet has never depended on its rulers to survive. Each reign, no matter how vast or complex, has always been temporary. The microbes that built the air were replaced by creatures that breathed it. The reptiles that dominated the land gave way to mammals that filled the same spaces. The thinking animal may have learned to record its own existence, but the cycles that sustain the world are older than memory and stronger than intellect. When the time comes for our species to fade, the systems we borrowed from will remain, patient and impartial. If one could look far ahead, beyond the reach of cities and history, the outlines of that endurance would be visible. Forests would reclaim the spaces where steel and concrete once stood. Roads would crack and crumble under moss and vine. Rivers would return to their natural courses, washing over ruins and carrying fragments of civilization downstream. In time, even those traces would vanish, buried under layers of sediment or consumed by the slow work of microbes. The planet would heal itself in the same way it always has, not through violence, but through quiet persistence. Long before that, changes will begin. The same processes that have shaped every extinction and recovery will continue to operate. The atmosphere, altered by human industry, will eventually find equilibrium again. Carbon levels will rise and fall. Temperatures will fluctuate. Ice will grow and retreat. Oceans will absorb, circulate, and release their stored gases. The biosphere will adjust, not instantly but gradually, through the relentless adaptability of life. Some species will perish. Others will thrive in the conditions we leave behind. Evolution will not stop simply because we are gone. It will resume its rhythm, selecting new survivors suited to the altered Earth. The insects will remain, as they always have, indifferent to our disappearance. Their resilience is unmatched. They will fill the forests again, pollinate new generations of plants, and break down the remains of our constructions as if they were fallen trees. Microbes will digest the residues of metal and plastic, breaking them into simpler forms that re-enter the cycles of soil and sea. Fungi will grow through the abandoned cities, feeding on wood, paint, and even stone, their filaments spreading into cracks where roots will follow. The quiet empire beneath the surface will reclaim its place above it. In 1,000 years, the outlines of human civilization might still be recognizable, but softened by nature's touch. In 10,000, only traces will remain. The metals we mined and forged will corrode into dust. The plastics will crumble under sunlight, their fragments absorbed into sediments and ocean floors. In 1,000,000 years, our monuments will be fossils, our cities buried under new layers of geology. The Earth will not remember us as we remember ourselves. It will remember us as a brief geologic shimmer, a pulse of activity recorded in rock. Even our extinction, if it comes, will not be unique. Life has recovered from greater losses before. The Permian extinction wiped out most species, and yet the planet flourished again. The Cretaceous impact ended the dinosaurs, but opened the door for mammals and birds. Humanity's decline would be only another turn of the same cycle. The Earth has seen 5 mass extinctions already. A 6th, even one of our making, would not end the planet's story. It would simply begin another. Long after the last human voice fades, the seasons will continue. Winds will sweep across plains where cities once stood. Rain will fall on empty streets, washing them clean. The oceans will rise and recede, carving new coastlines. The tectonic plates will shift, building mountains and pulling others down. The planet will keep remaking itself, as it has since the beginning. Time, to the Earth, is not a threat. It is the medium of renewal. Some forms of life might inherit what we leave behind. Intelligent or not, they will evolve to fill the niches we once occupied. Birds, rats, or even cephalopods might develop new capacities of thought and behaviour. The ability to reason is not confined to one species. It is a potential written into evolution itself. Somewhere, someday, consciousness may arise again, in a new form suited to a new world. They might look upon the remains of our age with curiosity, as we look at fossils of those before us. They might wonder what kind of creatures we were, what drove us to build and destroy, and why we vanished. The future Earth, untouched by our intentions, will still be beautiful. Forests will stretch over continents, teeming with creatures we cannot imagine. Coral reefs, if they survive, will recover their colours. New ecosystems will evolve from the ruins of old ones. The diversity of life, which we reduced for a moment in time, will bloom again in ways beyond prediction. The planet does not cling to the past. It transforms it. Over millions of years, the continents will continue to move. Africa will merge with Europe, closing the Mediterranean Sea. The Atlantic will widen until its floor begins to subduct beneath new mountain ranges. The Pacific will shrink, its islands drawn together into future supercontinents. Climate zones will shift, deserts turning to grasslands, grasslands to forests, forests to ice. Species will come and go, adapting to the endless movement of the crust beneath their feet. The fingerprints of humanity will fade into this motion, absorbed by the same tectonic forces that erase the traces of the earliest life. The atmosphere itself will change again, as it has countless times before. The balance of oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon will fluctuate. Perhaps future plants will evolve new methods of photosynthesis, suited to the light of a slightly dimmer sun. Perhaps the oceans will develop new chemistries, supporting forms of life unrecognizable to us. The cycles of day and night, of season and tide will continue in their quiet perfection. Even the moon, drifting slowly away from Earth each year, will still cast its pale reflection on the waves. The stars above will shift too. Constellations will distort and fade. New stars will form, others will die. In 100 million years, the night sky will be unrecognizable to any mind that remembers ours. The Milky Way itself will collide with the Andromeda Galaxy, forming a new cosmic structure. By then, the traces of our existence will be microscopic. Isotopes in rock, patterns in fossilized sediment, a few durable artifacts drifting silently through space. The universe will continue its expansion, indifferent and magnificent, and the Earth will orbit quietly within it, just as it has always done. To imagine that distant world is to recognize how brief our chapter has been. The reign of the thinking animal, measured against the scale of geological time, is no more than a flicker. The microbes have ruled for billions of years, the dinosaurs for hundreds of millions. Even the mammals in their fullness will likely continue long after we're gone. Our moment is real but fleeting, defined not by its duration but by its awareness. For the first time, the Earth has known itself through our eyes. That awareness will remain its most enduring legacy. The stories we leave behind, our art, our science, our memory of the world, will be gone one day, but their echoes will persist in the systems we shaped. The carbon we released will be absorbed and buried, forming new minerals. The molecules we synthesized will break apart and rejoin others, becoming part of the ongoing chemistry of the planet. The traces of our buildings, machines, and networks will erode into dust, which will feed new soils. Nothing truly ends, it simply changes form. Even now, the resilience of life is visible everywhere we look. In abandoned cities, trees break through pavement, roots winding around glass and steel. In deserts, seeds wait for years to bloom after a single rainfall. In the depths of the ocean, where sunlight never reaches, bacteria feed on minerals from the planet's core. In the frozen soil of the Arctic, microbes sleep, ready to awaken when the ice recedes. The Earth's vitality is not dependent on us. It breathes with or without our presence. If humans remain long enough to see the patterns clearly, they might learn to live within them instead of against them. They might choose to become participants rather than architects, to restore balance rather than chase mastery. The possibility of endurance extends to us too, if we learn to remember our place in the sequence of rulers, one among many, temporary but meaningful. The knowledge that the Earth will continue without us need not be despair. It can be peace. For the planet, time is never tragedy. Every extinction has been followed by renewal. Every collapse has opened new pathways for life. The Earth's endurance is not defiance, it is patience. It waits through fire, ice, and silence. It does not hurry, it simply persists. Even if one day the oceans dry, the air thins and the sun grows too hot, the atoms that once composed life will remain. They will scatter into the cosmos, forming part of other worlds. Somewhere, perhaps, they will reassemble into new forms, the same matter reborn in different patterns. The story of the Earth is inseparable from the story of the universe, and both are still unfolding. If there are beings somewhere in that far future who can think and wonder, they might find evidence of this world. Fossils of creatures long gone, traces of oceans long evaporated, signals faintly echoing across time. They might understand that life once thrived here, that it thought, built, and dreamed. They might see the marks of our existence and recognize in them the same striving that drives their own. In that recognition, the memory of the Earth would live on. But even if no consciousness remains to remember, the endurance of the planet does not depend on memory. The cycles of matter and energy will continue. The mountains will rise and fall, the seas will form and vanish, the light of the sun will still touch the surface, warming the stones and stirring the winds. The world will continue to move in silence, alive in ways beyond thought. The hidden kingdoms will still be there, thriving wherever conditions allow. Bacteria will live deep beneath the crust, drawing energy from chemical reactions in rock. Fungi will grow in the last shadows of forests, breaking down the remains of what once was. The laws of chemistry will keep playing their endless symphony of reactions, turning the remnants of life into the ingredients of new beginnings. After us, the Earth will not mourn. It will remember only through transformation. Our monuments will crumble, but their minerals will nourish new landscapes. Our cities will fade, but their ruins will form habitats for moss, insects, and birds. The legacy of humanity will not be our machines or our structures, but the changes we made to the biosphere, some destructive, some creative, woven permanently into the planet's ongoing evolution. It is humbling to realize that the Earth has always been preparing for what comes next. Every extinction has been a rehearsal for renewal. Every fall of a kingdom has been a pause before the rise of another. Life has never been static, and neither has the planet. The end of our age will be no different. The sun will rise, the wind will move through leaves, and the rain will fall long after we're gone. The same elements that formed our bodies will still circulate through soil, sea, and sky. The same chemistry that made thought possible will continue its endless experiment. The Earth endures not because it resists change, but because it embraces it completely. Somewhere far in the future, when the last traces of human language have dissolved, and even the continents themselves have shifted into unfamiliar shapes, the planet will still turn beneath whatever sky remains. Its pulse will still be measurable in the tides, its breath still visible in the movement of clouds. Whether or not anything is left to witness it, the beauty of that endurance will remain complete, and if thought ever rises again, if another species looks upon the world and wonders as we once did, it will find a planet rich with memory, not of us as individuals, but of the endless continuity of life. It will find evidence of the same cycles, the same struggles, the same persistence that define all existence. The Earth will still be what it has always been, a vessel for change, a cradle for possibility, a stage for whatever comes next. After us, the Earth will not be empty. It will be full of motion, of chemistry, of life in new and unexpected forms. Its endurance is not a question of if, but of how. It will continue through every transformation, carrying forward the legacy of everything that ever lived upon it. The crowns that once adorned our species will fall as all others have, but the rhythm of the planet will remain. The wind will still move through valleys, the seas will still whisper against the shore, the world will still remember the pattern of a life because it has never forgotten. And in that unending rhythm, in the silence after the noise, in the calm after the storm, in the stillness after thought, the Earth will continue to endure. You've made it all the way here, through oceans and forests, through fire and ice, through every age the Earth has ever known. You've followed the rhythm of time from the first living cell to the quiet hum of what comes after us. Maybe the room around you feels still now. Maybe the world feels a little larger than it did before. That's how it should feel. The story never really ends. The Earth is still moving beneath your feet. Somewhere roots are pushing through soil. Somewhere wind is shaping stone. Somewhere life is beginning again, quietly, as it always does. The same chemistry that built every creature that ever lived is still at work, right now, building the next. You are part of that continuity. Every breath you take carries molecules that once moved through forests, oceans, and other living beings. Every atom in you has travelled through stars and storms, through time longer than memory. The planet does not hold us apart from it. We are the Earth, remembering itself for a moment. As you lie here, breathing, maybe let yourself feel that connection. The air you inhale is ancient. The gravity that holds you is the same that shaped mountains and tides. The warmth that touches your skin comes from a star that has watched every age of this planet unfold. You're not separate from any of it. You never were. The world is quieter now than when it began, but it still hums with life. The insects still move under the leaves. The fungi still build their networks below. The oceans still breathe in rhythm with the moon. Everything is still here, continuing, enduring, waiting for the next sunrise. If you close your eyes, you can almost feel the long story beneath it all, not as words or history, but as something deeper. The pulse of a planet that has never stopped. The slow turning of a world that carries every past and every future inside it. It keeps moving, even when we sleep. Thank you for listening, for being part of that quiet motion tonight. If this journey soothed you, if it made the world feel wide and calm, you can stay with us. There are many more stories waiting, all unfolding under the same sky. For now, you don't have to think anymore. You can rest. The earth is still turning. The air is still moving. The story is still being written softly everywhere around you. Good night.